Hello, curious people. Today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable now. I stepped into the stories. I remember the day I found it, as if it were yesterday. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the flea market on the outskirts of our quaint little town. It was the kind of day where everything seemed still, the heat lingering, pressing down on everything. We couldn't afford another bad season. The stress was eating at both of us, turning our once lively dinner table conversations into tense silences. I was desperate, grasping at straws, literally, trying to find something, anything that might help. I figured maybe this flea market would have something useful, though I didn't know what exactly I was looking for. That's when I saw it. Tucked between a pile of rusted tools, frayed ropes, and battered knickknacks was a scarecrow. It was old, worn out, and tattered. The kind of thing that had been through too many summers and winters, far more than it should have survived. Its burlap face was faded, sun-bleached, and split in places, the frayed edges fluttering in the wind like dead skin peeling from an old wound. Its clothes, a pair of ripped overalls and a threadbare flannel shirt, hung limp from its crooked frame, remnants of an era long forgotten. Despite its ragged appearance, something about it drew me in, and I couldn't look away. Maybe it was the unnatural way it stood out among the clutter, or maybe it was the way the light seemed to dim around it when I looked at it. I couldn't shake the feeling it was watching me, as if its dark, hollow eyes were tracking my every move, and the crooked smile stretched unnaturally wide, almost up to its ears, as though it knew a secret I didn't. The scarecrow seemed to catch Charlie's fancy too. He sniffed it cautiously before placing his paw on it, almost as if testing whether it was real. I snapped out of my thoughts when a man's voice suddenly cut through the eerie silence. It was the owner. He was a small, hunched figure standing behind the stall, half hidden in the shadows beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His leathery skin, deeply lined with wrinkles, hinted at a long, hard life. His face remained mostly obscured, his eyes concealed in the shadow of the hat, making it impossible to guess his age. An instinctual urge told me to turn away. Both the scarecrow and the man unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. "You're looking for something to keep the birds away, aren't you?" he said, without glancing up, his voice gravelly and dry. There was an accent, too, faint but old-fashioned, as though it belonged to another era. I blinked, startled by his accuracy. How could he know? I thought to myself. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say, my mouth suddenly dry. Then he looked up, meeting my gaze for a fleeting moment. "This here'll do the trick," he said, gesturing toward the scarecrow with a bony finger. "No birds, no rodents, no pests. You'll see." I hesitated, taking a closer look at the scarecrow. It looked as if it would fall apart if I so much as touched it. The wind tugged at its loose stitches, making them sway slightly, and I noticed a faint odor, musty, like damp earth mixed with decay. "Does it work?" I asked, my voice filled with skepticism. I didn't want to come off as too desperate, but I was. The man grinned, revealing a set of yellowed, uneven teeth. "It works," he said with an air of certainty that felt unsettling. "Better than you think. Just set it up in your field. It'll do the rest." My gut twisted with unease, and despite the creeping dread, I handed over the little cash I had left. The man took it without another word. I heaved the scarecrow into the bed of my truck, its hollow, straw-filled body thudding against the metal as I started my drive back to the farm. When I got home, the sun was setting, casting an orange hue across the farm. I glanced toward the house, where the warm light of the kitchen spilled through the windows. Clara was inside, cooking dinner, while the kids helped her set the table. The smell of roasting chicken wafted into the air. Charlie and I were immediately greeted by Sir Sunrise, a rooster who quietly came and perched himself on the back of the truck as I parked near the front porch. He observed in silence as I unloaded the scarecrow. Sir Sunrise earned his name from my 8-year-old son, Luke, thanks to his remarkable habit of crowing at exactly 6 a.m. every morning. It didn't matter if it was pouring rain, the middle of winter, or a cloudy morning when the sun didn't show. He always knew when it was time. He'd march up and down the porch, his triumphant cock-a-doodle-doo echoing for a full minute, ensuring the entire Smith household woke to his call. Oddly enough, that was the only time he ever crowed, even though he spent the rest of the day busily wandering the farm. Even stranger was the quiet, almost unspoken friendship he shared with Charlie. The two seemed to enjoy each other's company in a way that always surprised me. I hoisted the scarecrow onto my shoulders and made my way toward the field. The crops swayed in the soft evening breeze, rows of corn and wheat stretching out before me like sentinels. I chose a spot right in the middle, far enough from the house, but close enough that I could still watch it from the upstairs window. I attached the scarecrow to a wooden pole that was already planted deep in the soil. It stood crooked and eerie, its burlap face staring blankly at the sky. Sir Sunrise inaugurated the new addition in the field by performing a couple of customary laps around the pole before taking off, with Charlie eagerly chasing after him. My eyes, however, drifted toward Mr. Monroe's factory in the distance. For years, he had been acquiring land from my neighbors, and was determined to buy my property as well. He wasn't pleased when I turned him down. Ever since then, my farm has suffered. My crops have been constantly under attack, making me wonder if he was in any way involved. But without proof, all I could do was continue my work and hope things would eventually turn around. I took one last look at the scarecrow before walking back home to join my wife and kids for dinner. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the image of the scarecrow in the field, motionless, seemingly unthreatening, yet somehow menacing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that stitched smile, wide and knowing, as though it was waiting for something. Was I expecting some sort of miracle from it? Is that why I felt this knot in my stomach? Because deep down, I knew I was acting out of desperation and not thinking rationally. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but beyond that, there was silence. No crows cawing, no rustling in the crops, just an unsettling, unnatural silence. Meanwhile, Clara slept soundly beside me. I noticed the cut above her eyebrow, even in the pale moonlight, a scar from her youth. Despite her challenging childhood, she had a gift for finding peace in chaos, while I remained a light sleeper, needing exhaustion to fall into a deep slumber. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and eventually drifted to sleep. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to find the fields torn apart like before. But they were untouched. Not a single stalk was damaged. I looked toward the scarecrow, still standing in the same spot, and felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe the old peddler was right. Maybe it really was that effective. A couple more days went by, and the crops remained unharmed. Not a single bird or rodent dared to come near them. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in ages. I didn't fully understand how a scarecrow could make such a difference. The results defied logic, but I wasn't about to question it now. Clara noticed the shift in my mood too and began to believe again herself. She watched our children, Emma and Luke, play among the crops, their laughter ringing through the air like music after a long silence. It was as if the scarecrow had brought back more than just safety for the crops. It had brought back hope. But on the fourth night, things began to take a strange turn. I woke up in the dead of night to the sound of Sir Sunrise crowing, loud, persistent, and completely out of character. He was never one to crow at night. His routine was always the same, like clockwork at 6 a.m. My body, heavy with sleep, resisted the urge to get up. I waited, hoping he'd stop, but Sir Sunrise kept going, his calls growing louder, more driven. With a groan, I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled toward the window, expecting to see him perched where he usually roosted. But instead, Sir Sunrise was on the front porch, pacing back and forth, his head bobbing furiously, crowing as if the morning sun was already shining. But the thing that made my stomach lurch wasn't him. It was the moon. It hung in the sky, casting a pale glow over the fields. The crops swayed gently in the breeze, bathed in a strange coppery light. It was only then that I realized it wasn't just any moon. It was a total lunar eclipse. The blood moon hung above, eerie and red, painting the field in a haunting glow. But what I saw next stopped me cold. The scarecrow. It wasn't where I had left it. For a moment, I just stood there, blinking, my tired mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. I rubbed my eyes, squinted, even stepped closer to the window. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there it was, standing at the far end of the field, a place I had never placed it. My heart pounded in my chest. Who could have moved it? And why? Was it some prank? But who would come all the way out here in the middle of the night just for that? My thoughts raced, reaching for logical explanations that didn't quite add up. Maybe it was just my groggy, sleep-deprived brain playing tricks on me. The moonlight, the shadows, it could have easily created an illusion. Or maybe it was the wind, somehow shifting the scarecrow's position. Scarecrows were light, after all. It could have been anything. Right. I shook my head, telling myself it didn't matter. I could fix it in the morning. Still unsettled, I forced myself back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My dreams were strange, fragmented, filled with shadowy figures moving through the fields. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I got out of bed, hoping to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. To my relief, when I looked out the window, the scarecrow was back in its original spot. I sighed, feeling a wave of calm wash over me, but only for a fleeting moment, because when my gaze swept across the field, something caught my eye, and it made my stomach drop. A flock of crows were circling low over a patch of land near the edge of the field, the very spot where I had seen the scarecrow standing the night before. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. This was never going to be good news. Without hesitation, I bolted out of the house and raced toward the spot where the birds hovered, their dark wings cutting through the sky like a bad omen. The birds flew away when I reached the area, but what I saw made me momentarily speechless. Scattered among the crops were dead animals, birds, rodents, frogs, and other small creatures. They weren't just randomly lying there either. Their bodies were arranged in peculiar, almost ritualistic patterns, circles, spirals, rows, shapes that made my skin crawl. And the worst part? Straw. Pieces of straw, like the kind stuffed inside the scarecrow, were strewn around the animals, as if linking them to the figure that now loomed in the field. Advertisements. I knelt down, my fingers brushing over the straw. Sponsored content. Recommended by. At first, I wanted to believe it was a predator, some animal playing tricks, a fox or wild dog arranging its kills. But that thought quickly crumbled. The arrangement of the bodies was too precise, too deliberate. It felt wrong. Could this be Mr. Monroe's doing? Another twisted attempt by him to sabotage my farm. Before I could even finish the thought, Clara's voice echoed across the field, her tone sounding nervous and urgent. I looked up and saw her in the distance, standing on the front porch, her posture tense as though trying to intervene before something happened. But the thick rows of crops blocked my view, making it impossible to see what had her so panicked. I set off again, this time heading back toward the entrance of my own house. As I got closer, the menacing growl of Charlie pierced the air. When I pushed through the last of the crops, I saw him engaged in a tense standoff, his fur matted and streaked with blood, growling fiercely at Sir Sunrise. The rooster was badly injured, his feathers in disarray and blood dripping onto the ground. He wobbled, struggling to stay upright, yet remained defiant, determined to hold his ground in the fight. But Charlie wasn't finished. Before I could intervene, he lunged at the rooster, clamping down on his throat with his teeth. With a violent shake of his head, I heard the sickening snap of bone. Charlie finally released him, and the lifeless body dropped to the ground. Horror washed over me as blood pooled around the carcass. Charlie cleared his throat a couple of times, and in slow motion, I saw him extend his tongue, licking the blood clean off the floor in one swift motion. I stood frozen, unable to look away as Charlie, his tongue stained with blood and dirt, jerked and crouched momentarily, eyes closed, tilting his head down before releasing a loud howl, with his muzzle pointed skyward. He then darted off into the field before I could pin him down. I chased after him, but it was clear he wasn't interested in being found. I expected he would eventually find his way back home, though I wasn't sure what I would do with him upon his return. I had never seen him behave this way before. I struggled to piece together the events of the morning, wondering if there could be any correlation to last night. Deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion forming in my gut. This all began the moment I brought that scarecrow home. What had been a curious purchase at a roadside stand had now morphed into a source of growing dread, its tendrils curling tighter around my mind. And what about the dead animals? Were they also Charlie's doing? I had no clear answers, and I reluctantly glanced at the scarecrow perfectly positioned in the middle of the field. The smile stretching across its face stirred an uneasy feeling in me. "That is strike one, Patrick," a voice echoed in my head at that very moment. And for the first time, I considered getting rid of it, but as I looked at the crops around me, I was quietly taken aback by the risks I was willing to accept. Finally gathering my composure, I dealt with the dead animals, burying them one by one in haste before Clara could notice. She was already upset about Sir Sunrise and had spent the day looking for Charlie, convinced they had a falling out. Her suspicions were not yet on the scarecrow, and I hoped to keep it that way. Still, I forced myself to focus on the positives. The crops were thriving, better than ever, in fact. The rows were thick with green, healthy stalks, and the vegetables were coming in larger than expected. My family was on track to recoup our losses, and hopefully that would put us in a better financial position than we had been in years. But that night, as the wind whistled through the trees and rustled the leaves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, watching us. The scarecrow was more than just straw and cloth, and I could feel that deep in my bones. I pressed the pillow to my ears, desperate to drown out the sounds of the night and drift off to sleep. But then a loud, piercing howl shattered the stillness. It was Charlie, no doubt, somewhere out in the field in the distance, howling into the night. Somehow, I eventually succumbed to exhaustion and drifted off to sleep. But I was jolted awake by my daughter Emma's urgent voice calling for me. "Dad, come quick." Her frantic tone sliced through the morning calm like a knife, pulling me from my dreams. Heart racing, I scrambled out of bed and rushed outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light across the farm. I spotted Emma near the edge of the field, crouched next to Charlie. A wave of dread washed over me as I approached. There lay Charlie, lifeless and caked in mud, his front paws badly bruised and the flesh peeled back, exposing the jutting bones. It was clear he had been digging with a frantic desperation and eventually died from the sheer exhaustion. Next to him was a mound of sand, the grave where Sir Sunrise had been buried. Emma looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what happened, Dad. I found him like this." The horror of the scene settled over me, a chilling weight in my chest. Clara soon joined us, and we decided to bury Charlie with Sir Sunrise, since they were pals after all. Once everybody went back inside, I ventured into the field, holding a shovel in my hand, wondering what else I might uncover. As I walked through the field, I noticed small mounds of earth scattered around, like hastily made burial sites. It was all too clear now what Charlie had been doing throughout the night. With a shovel, I dug into one of the mounds and uncovered a dead pigeon. Another revealed a large rodent. The field was littered with these makeshift graves, and I couldn't even guess how many there were. When I turned, my stomach clenched. Luke was standing there, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What's going on, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion as he looked around. I forced a smile, kneeling down and placing my hands gently on his shoulders. "Nothing to worry about, buddy," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Charlie was just being Charlie. We'll take care of it." For the next 15 minutes, I tried to reassure him, telling him he had to be strong, that growing up meant taking responsibility and knowing when to keep things to himself. "You're a man now," I said, "and sometimes we do what we have to protect the family. Don't mention this to Clara or Emma, okay? They're already worried enough." Luke nodded, but the unease in his eyes was hard to miss. I hated myself for what I was doing, gaslighting my own son. But with the harvest only a couple of weeks away, I had no choice. The farm had to come first. As Luke slowly made his way back to the house, I glanced toward Mr. Monroe's property in the distance, and then back at the scarecrow. I felt a lump form in my throat. "That's strike two, Patrick," I muttered to myself. I knew I couldn't handle another incident like this. If anything else happened, I'd have to start thinking seriously about other contingencies. Time was running out. Determined to put my fears to rest, I decided to keep watch over the field myself, alone in the dead of night. So the rest of the morning, I tended to the field, watering the crops, and going about my usual farming routine. Advertisements. And when evening finally arrived, we all ate our meal in silence. One by one, everyone retreated to their rooms while I remained vigilant. Once everyone was in bed, I grabbed my shotgun and crept up to the second floor, where I had a clear view of the entire field. I had already set up lights at the corner so that I had sufficient visibility. I positioned myself at the window, determined to stay awake through the night. Hours ticked by slowly. The only sounds were the faint whisper of the wind and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse settling around me. My eyes eventually grew heavy, even as my body fought the exhaustion at every level. But I must have drifted off at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, I was startled by how still everything seemed. I instinctively glanced out the window, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the scarecrow standing in its usual spot. But it wasn't there. My heart leaped in my throat as I scanned the field, and then I saw it, moving. The scarecrow was moving. Not walking, not stumbling, but drifting. It glided across the ground as if something unseen was pulling it, dragging it toward the far end of the field. Then it suddenly stopped, and to my horror, I saw the birds descend quietly around it. My hands trembled as I bolted out of the chair, shotgun in one hand and the old lantern in the other. I didn't wake Clara or the kids. I didn't want to frighten them. But my pulse pounded in my ears as I sprinted into the field, the lantern swinging wildly in my arm. The scarecrow, now a distant silhouette, was still drifting, disappearing into the dark edges of the field. I sprinted after it, the lantern's glow swinging wildly in the darkness. When I reached the spot, I nearly dropped it. Dead animals lay scattered everywhere: birds, mice, frogs, and even a rabbit, arranged in eerie, precise circles. The smell of decay clinging to the air. Out of the corner of my eye, I then spotted it again. The scarecrow, this time drifting slowly toward the opposite end. I ran toward it again, gripping my shotgun tightly as the lantern swayed in my hand and the wind howled around me. But as I approached the scarecrow, I froze. It wasn't the scarecrow that terrified me. It was Emma, my 12-year-old daughter, carrying the scarecrow as if it weighed nothing. The pole rested effortlessly on her small shoulder, her hands gripping it firmly yet without emotion. Her movements were slow and mechanical, her eyes wide and blank, as if she were trapped in a trance. Behind her, Luke knelt in the dirt, his small hands stained with blood. He was carefully arranging a sparrow's body among the others, his face blank, his eyes unblinking. With a firm grip, he squeezed another rat's neck until it went limp, then placed it on the ground, completing the circle of dead animals. A wave of dread rose in my chest as I choked out a call. my voice thick with fear. "Emma, Luke, what are you doing?" They didn't respond. They didn't even flinch. Emma kept walking, gripping the pole attached to the scarecrow, and moving forward. Luke silently followed behind her. Then Emma suddenly stopped. She raised the scarecrow and pointed it westward. And from the shadows animals suddenly emerged. Birds swooped down from the trees, rodents scurried out of the soil, and insects crawled from every crevice, all of them moving toward the scarecrow with eerie obedience. I could only watch in horror as Luke picked up a rock and began smashing the animals one by one. Each brutal strike was met with a sickening thud, and yet none of the creatures moved. They remained rooted to their spots, oblivious to the carnage unfolding around them. The air felt thick with something sinister, something beyond my understanding. My chest tightened as I staggered back, gasping for air. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then Luke bent down, grabbed a dead rodent from the ground, and sank his teeth into it. He bit into the fur with the desperation of a ravenous animal, blood smearing his lips as he chewed, completely lost in the frenzy. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized how the scarecrow was controlling my children, transforming them into something unnatural, something monstrous. A torrent of anger erupted inside me, every cell in my body pulsing with raw fury. My hands shook, but my mind was suddenly clear. I knew exactly what I had to do. I dropped my lantern and rushed toward Emma, yanking the scarecrow from her hands and then hurling it to the ground. My kids remained mute spectators, rooted to their spots as they continued to be trapped in their hypnotic trance. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the scarecrow with all my might. It shattered on impact, igniting the scarecrow in flames. Without hesitation, I fired my shotgun at the fuel-soaked straw, and an explosion erupted, engulfing the figure in a fiery blaze. Emma blinked for the first time, as if suddenly waking from a dream, confused about how she had ended up in the middle of the field. My son, Luke, stared down at his blood-stained hands, clutching the dead rat. Horror washed over his face, his lip trembling as he met my eyes. "I didn't mean to, Daddy. I didn't mean to," he sobbed, wiping the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. I dropped to my knees, pulling both of them into my arms as the fire crackled and roared, the acrid smell of burning straw filling the air. Through the flames, I watched a shadowy figure emerge, its silhouette shaped like a man, writhing and twisting, struggling to break free. For a fleeting moment, it seemed almost alive, thrashing in a desperate attempt to escape the flames. But the fires consumed him, pulling him deeper into the inferno until, at last, he vanished. I closed my eyes briefly, using the moment to utter a silent prayer to the Lord, hugging my children tighter, grateful that it was finally behind us. Together, we slowly walked back to the house, each step laden with the weight of what had just transpired. Just as we were about to enter the house, Clara opened the door, worry etched across her face. She had woken up sensing something was wrong, and when she found us missing, fear gripped her. As we stepped inside, she wrapped us in a warm embrace. I immediately felt a sense of relief, hoping that this whole nightmare was finally behind us. Over the next few weeks, my crops flourished, yielding a harvest that far exceeded my expectations. We were pulled back from the brink of financial ruin, but it came at a cost. Both Emma and Luke suffered from relentless nightmares, waking up screaming in the night, and it would be months before they could fully recover. I, too, struggled with sleep, waking in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of the scarecrow. "It's gone," I kept telling myself. "The scarecrow is gone." And every night, I prayed that it would stay that way. My 8-year-old daughter's screams pierced the quiet night as I checked the time on my watch. It reads 10:12 p.m. Anxious, I make my way to her bedroom and push the door open, flicking on the light switch. There she is, sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. I rush to her side, embracing her tightly as I try to calm her, but her distress seems unending. I keep swaying her gently back and forth until she finally calms down enough to speak. With a soothing tone, I assured her she was safe and that I would protect her. With a soothing tone, I assured her she was safe and that I would protect her. "It's ok. I'm here." Through her sobs, she manages to say, "It's Mr. Chickenhead Man. He's in the room with us." Advertisements. I hold her even closer and say, "Sweetie, there's no such thing as Mr. Chickenhead Man. It was just a dream." She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "But Daddy, he was real. I saw him standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with his big, round eyes." I furrowed my brow, trying to understand her fear. "Honey, sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're half asleep. There's no monster here. It's just your imagination." She clung to me, still trembling. "Promise you won't leave, Daddy." I hugged her tighter, reassuring her. "I promise, sweetheart, I won't leave you alone. Now let's try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is a new day, and there's no room for scary dreams." I continue to sway gently with my daughter until her crying stops, and then I carefully tuck her back under her covers. Taking a seat in the chair by her bedside, I watch over her until she falls asleep once more. This is a familiar routine. Nightmares have plagued her before, but it's always the same sinister character, Mr. Chickenhead Man, that haunts her dreams. From her descriptions, he's a figure in a dark suit, black vest, black shirt, and a red tie. Black leather shoes and gloves completed his attire, and he carries a pocket watch adorned with a gleaming silver chain fastened to his vest pocket. Of course, the most unsettling detail is his head, a peculiar fusion of a chicken's head and a man's body. She's unsure whether it's a mask concealing a human face or a real chicken's head. The bizarre Mr. Chickenhead Man saga started back years ago, when our youngest daughter, Elsa, was just 5 years old and started pilfering cookies from the kitchen. Like most mischievous youngsters caught in the act, she invented an elaborate excuse, and that's when this peculiar, eerie character first entered our lives. "It wasn't me. Mr. Chickenhead Man took the cookies," Elsa exclaimed, her eyes wide with a mixture of innocence and alarm. Baffled by this unexpected turn of events, I inquired, "What do you mean by Mr. Chickenhead Man?" She responded hastily, speaking in hushed tones, as if she feared the very mention of his name. "You know, the man in a fancy suit with a chicken head. He's the one who took the cookies." I couldn't help but find her tale utterly preposterous. It seemed like she was weaving fantastical stories to conceal her own mischievous acts of cookie thievery. I had no inkling that my daughter possessed such a vivid imagination. My wife had read somewhere that encouraging a child to draw their nightmares could help them confront and conquer their fears. So we decided to put this theory to the test and asked Elsa to sketch a picture of this enigmatic Mr. Chickenhead Man. The only reasonable explanation was that she had concocted the entire character. After all, we didn't want to fuel Elsa's fertile imagination or her penchant for weaving fantasies. Most importantly, we didn't want our daughter to carry the weight of guilt over such a trivial matter. Hence, we never mentioned the topic again, hoping that Elsa's flights of fancy would soon fade away. Spooky narrative audiobooks. The following year, someone broke a window, and once again, Elsa accused Mr. Chickenhead Man of doing it. He had supposedly entered the room, broken the window, and left. I was at a loss about how to handle this situation. It was clear that Elsa was concealing something. As a parent, you're responsible for monitoring your child's actions, but I didn't want to blow this out of proportion. Many kids outgrow imaginary companions after a few years, and I didn't want to stifle her creativity either. During our visit to my mother the following week, we decided to share our concerns about Elsa's recent troubles. "She keeps blaming it on this imaginary character named Mr. Chickenhead Man," I explained. "I don't want to stifle her creativity, but I also don't want her resorting to lies to avoid responsibility." My mother pondered this for a moment before responding. "A child's imagination is a potent force. Did you know there are things, like demons, entities, spirits, or whatever you want to call them, that exist beyond our material world. When someone invests enough fear or belief in them, they can cross over and take on a physical form, even interact with our reality. When that happens, it can be quite dangerous. Are you suggesting that Mr. Chickenhead Man might be real? I asked, intrigued and somewhat unsettled. No, but I'm not ruling it out either, my mother replied. The power of the human mind is an incredible force. It's one of the universe's creative engines. What a child envisions can become real to them. I'm not passing judgment on whether it's good or bad. It simply is. So when Elsa insists Mr. Chickenhead Man is real, it's because she believes he is. If you nurture her imagination, it will flourish. If you discourage it, Mr. Chickenhead Man might fade away. I think Elsa made him up, I countered. I don't want to give her an excuse for misbehavior. We need to give her the opportunity to learn self-control. If we don't, we're only teaching her to lie. And that's not what we want. We want her to be honest and truthful. If she learns to lie, she'll become like so many others in the world, my mother wisely advised. The conversation with my mother left me with a mix of thoughts and emotions. The idea that Elsa's vivid imagination could somehow manifest into a tangible presence was both intriguing and unsettling. Balancing encouragement for her creativity with the need for honesty and responsibility became a delicate task. As the school year began, Elsa's behavior took a troubling turn. They summoned her to the principal's office for placing nails at the bottom of the slide where other children were playing. This dangerous act resulted in her suspension for 10 days, and throughout that entire time, she persisted in blaming Mr. Chickenhead Man. Strangely, incidents like this became more frequent. Whenever questioned, she consistently insisted that he had just been in the room or was in the process of leaving when someone entered. It felt as though she was constantly getting into trouble, from fights to damaging property or stealing things. These occurrences became a weekly ordeal. When Elsa entered the 3rd grade, we decided to move to a different town, hoping that a new school would provide a fresh start. Initially, it seemed to work. Elsa transformed into a model student for the first few months. However, her old behavior slowly began resurfacing. She broke into the teacher's cabinet and stole items, which resulted in her being placed on permanent in-school suspension. Perplexed and concerned, we confronted her about her actions, and once again, she attributed it all to Mr. Chickenhead Man. When Elsa turned 9, we made an unsettling discovery. While she was at school, my wife decided to clean her room. During this process, she reached under the bed and found an old shoebox. Upon opening it, she was met with sheer terror. The box contained a gruesome sight. It was filled with dead birds, each of them decapitated and with their small eyes gouged out. Shocked and horrified, my wife showed me the box when I returned home from work. When we confronted Elsa about this horrifying find, she once again attributed it all to Mr. Chickenhead Man. It became clear that something more profound was at play, so we decided to seek therapy for her. 2 years later, when Elsa was 11, a devastating incident occurred. Our house caught fire, and the authorities determined it was a case of arson. Once again, Elsa found herself facing police questioning, and her response remained consistent. She pointed the blame at Mr. Chickenhead Man, uttering, "It was Mr. Chickenhead Man." Elsa's persistent claims about Mr. Chickenhead Man frustrated those around her who didn't believe her. They considered her a suspect in some of these incidents and subsequently sentenced her to therapy by the courts. During the session, Elsa continued to insist that Mr. Chickenhead Man was real and responsible for her actions. The psychologist, with a calm and patient demeanor, delved into Elsa's world, attempting to understand the source of her beliefs. The psychologist recommended ongoing therapy to help Elsa navigate and express her emotions more constructively. As parents, we embraced the guidance, hoping that through understanding and support, Elsa could find healthier ways to cope with the challenges she faced. Her adolescent troubles eventually became forgotten, and everyone involved moved on with their lives. But for Elsa, these events continued to haunt her, and she steadfastly maintained that Mr. Chickenhead Man was to blame. At the age of 12, Elsa's actions took a dangerous turn when she tampered with the brakes on a classmate's bike. Fortunately, the classmate suffered only minor cuts and bruises. The police were called, and Elsa was arrested once more. However, this time, when they questioned her, Elsa was so deeply traumatized that she couldn't even recall the details of what had happened. Authorities attributed this memory loss to the previous fire incident and the therapy she had undergone, suggesting that it might be a side effect of the treatment. Elsa's life was becoming increasingly enigmatic and concerning, leaving us all searching for answers to the bizarre events that continued to unfold around her. Elsa's ongoing struggles at school, combined with her unwavering insistence on blaming Mr. Chickenhead Man, led to a new series of therapy sessions. By the time she reached the age of 14, our patience had worn thin. It felt like our daughter was in constant trouble, engaging in fights, stealing, and being dishonest. The therapeutic interventions seemed to offer only temporary relief, and we grappled with the complexity of Elsa's situation. Her belief in Mr. Chickenhead Man persisted, overshadowing any progress made in therapy. The once hopeful prospect of a brighter future for Elsa now seemed shrouded in uncertainty. When she turned 15, we decided to move back to our old neighborhood, hoping that returning to familiar surroundings might bring about positive change. Initially, the shift seemed to work. Elsa behaved like an average 15-year-old and seemed to adjust well. However, she still felt like an outsider among her peers. Elsa, who had always been talkative, used to share every detail of her day with us, including hurtful comments from her classmates. Over time, though, she began reverting to her previous problematic behavior. My wife came up with an idea to help Elsa integrate better. She was friends with the mother of one of Elsa's classmates and arranged a sleepover with a few teenage girls from her class. The hope was that making new friends might help Elsa calm her rebellious nature. On the appointed night, Elsa stayed at her friend's house, and the girls gathered in the basement to watch a movie. We asked Elsa to call us before bedtime to check in and see how everything was going. It seemed like Elsa was enjoying the company of these teenage girls, and we went to bed that night with a sense of satisfaction, hoping that this newfound camaraderie would have a positive impact on our daughter's life. The sound of pounding on our front door jolted me awake, and I checked the clock. It read 1:47 a.m. With my wife behind me, I hurried to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Elsa, and she appeared utterly terrified. I swiftly opened the door, and she rushed into my arms while my wife closed the door behind her. "He killed them. He killed them all," Elsa exclaimed frantically. "Who?" I inquired as we held her close. "Who killed who?" "It was a disaster. Chickenhead Man," Elsa sobbed, burying her head in my chest. "He killed all the girls there, and now he's coming for me." "What?" I asked as we made our way to the couch and sat down. "The girls are dead." "Yes, Daddy, maybe even Nancy's mom. She was upstairs when Mr. Chickenhead Man came," Elsa cried. "When did this happen?" I pressed for details. "It was only about an hour ago. We were in the basement watching the movie when the door opened," Elsa explained, her terror palpable. "He killed them all." "Elsa, please, stop it. Mr. Chickenhead Man is not real," I asserted firmly. "But he is, Daddy. If you go in there, you will die, just like all the girls." Elsa screamed, breaking free from my embrace and falling back onto the couch. As we turned to look at the picture window, a chilling sight met us. A man dressed in a black suit with a red tie, sporting a chicken head, was standing there peering in. A man dressed in a black suit with a red tie, sporting a chicken head, stood there peering in. In his right hand, he held a bloody knife. Our hearts raced as he gazed at us and began to leisurely approach the front door. Fear consumed us as the man with the grotesque appearance continued to move closer to the front door. The room felt heavy, and Elsa's words, once mere conversation, now turned into a chilling reality, leaving us in disbelief mixed with terror. Upon reaching the doorstep, the man raised a bloody knife, its metallic gleam sending shivers down our spines in the moonlit night. Panic ensued, and I fumbled for the phone, desperately dialing the emergency number. The dispatcher's voice on the line became our lifeline as I conveyed the unimaginable events unfolding in our home. Elsa, still huddled on the couch, continued to scream, her terror escalating with each passing moment. My wife and I, paralyzed by fear and confusion, grappled with the instinct to shield our daughter, while realizing the threat at the door surpassed any rational understanding. Emergency. What is your emergency? Came the voice from the phone. We need the police. I need you to stay calm. Help is on the way, the dispatcher assured. Can you describe the situation? Is anyone injured? There's a man with a chicken head outside our door. He had a knife. My daughter says he killed everyone at the sleepover. We need help. I understand. The police are on their way. Make sure all doors and windows are locked. Stay where you are. The man with the chicken head pressed his grotesque face against the window, his eyes fixated on us with an unsettling intensity. The seconds felt like an eternity as we awaited the police. Questions swirled in my mind. Was this a horrifying manifestation of Elsa's nightmares, or had something truly otherworldly invaded our reality? He is looking in the window, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Do you have any weapons? The dispatcher inquired, her tone carrying a mix of concern and urgency. No, I replied, the vulnerability of our situation sinking in. Try to stay calm. The police are just minutes away. On one dark, foggy morning, a news station began the daily evening broadcast to Sevier County, a low-population area in the middle of nowhere. It began with a poppy intro song, canned footage of various county locales, and fast-forwarded time-lapses of the weather. When the intro wrapped up, the station's logo appeared briefly on the screen before taking position at the lower left corner. The screen showed footage of the child's home, a wide panning shot of a well-kept front yard covered in yellow caution tape and strobing with red and blue police lights. One small boy, who lived in a very poor home and had nothing better to do besides play with Legos in front of the living room TV, noticed something. Advertisements. What's that? The boy asked his mother, who sat in a recliner behind him reading a novel. The mother marked her place in the book and looked around for her glasses that were nowhere nearby, before giving up and squinting at what her son was pointing to on the TV. Buy best-selling books online. What's what? She asked. That, the boy said, pointing to the field beyond the child's yard. What is that? A horse field, the mother said simply. The field is a flat stretch of land next to the child's house with only a few salt blocks and troughs spotted around. Even through the static of the TV, wisps of fog and frosted grass are easily visible. Their neighbors had a few horses that walked around that field all day. Not far, the boy said, then pointed to a specific spot in the field. That. The mother shrugged, took another doomed look for her glasses, and searched the screen again. For 1 second, she thought she could see a rough shape in the mist at the far end of the yard. Before she can get a closer look, the screen goes back to the newscasters. I'm sorry, bud. I didn't see anything. Advertisements. The next morning, the Sevier County News intro kicked off at 7 a.m. with the same canned footage of rolling clouds and cheaply animated logo. The newscasters wear inexpensive clothing and shuffle empty papers on their table. Good morning, Sevier County. This is James Bergeron and Audrey Rasmussen here to give you a quick morning update before the day's scheduled programming. Kicking things off, Audrey continued, and as you've probably noticed, a heavy fall-time fog has set in around the Sevier County area. Though fog is common this time of year, in some areas it's thick enough to stop traffic. Local meteorologist Jason Whitman, says James, has informed us that due to the cold weather and thickness of the fog, It may not dissipate until later in the week. All residents should travel with caution, including using your headlight brights and walking with reflective material. For a brief update on the ongoing investigation into the suicide of Madeleine Childs, we have Kenneth Spears down for a brief interview with Richard and Evelyn Childs at Maylene Elementary. The image cuts to a young lady in a PBS Channel 3 sweater standing in front of Maylene Elementary. Behind her is a thin, tired-looking man with unkempt hair, a 5 o'clock shadow, and heavy shadows under his eyes. He lightly holds a little girl by the shoulders. The girl is the spitting image of her father, the only difference being even more pronounced shadows under her eyes. While the reporter is very well lit by the news camera's huge lights, the two behind her are almost shapes in the darkness until the light is swung towards them. Only one child in the county is watching the live report, a young girl home with a bad cold. Why are they doing this? She thinks as she bundles into her blankets and pillows and watches the TV in her room. That girl looks so sad. Kenneth Spears, on her 4th day of what she thought was going to be a fun and exciting internship, starts her report. "Good morning, Sevier County," Kenneth Spears says, smiling a wide smile that looks extremely out of place. The fog is so thick that the world outside of the intensely bright camera lights seems to be entirely an inky purple. The only outlier is a row of classroom windows behind Richard and Evelyn, filled with dim light, but even those are so distant and non-penetrating to the fog that they look like phantom gaslights. "I'm here with Richard and Evelyn Childs," Kenneth says before slowly walking with the camera towards the two, husband and daughter of Madeleine Childs. Richard winces. Evelyn frowns. Kenna either doesn't notice or doesn't care. Dropping to one knee, she speaks to Evelyn while holding a large microphone close to the child's face. "Evelyn, how are you doing?" she asks with a wide smile still on her face from what could only be a very warped sense of professionalism. "All this fog is pretty creepy, right? What a day to come back to school." Evelyn smiles a little and nods. Richard rubs her shoulder lightly. "We just wanted to say that we're glad to see you doing well," Kenneth says after an awkward pause. She's about to say more before Evelyn abruptly turns to her father, hugs him, and runs towards the school. The sick girl bundled in blankets at home smiles, happy that the girl got away. Kenneth Spears frowns, resets her Fox broadcast smile, and approaches Richard for an interview that the county sheriff had been very adamant to him that he make. Kenna is about to speak when a loud, shrill scream cuts her off. In the footage, those few who happen to be watching see Evelyn running back to her father. The sick girl at home begins to scream as she sees what Evelyn is running from. It's her. Evelyn screams, over and over. It's her. It's her. It's her. Richard picks up Evelyn and moves toward the camera's light. It's the only thing even moderately bright and easily visible around. Kenneth Spears freezes, too confused and inexperienced to do anything more than stand and stare at where Evelyn had run from. All she, the cameraman, and Richard can see is a vague outline of the school, except a silhouette in the fog. The adults stare dumbfounded while Evelyn and the sick girl at home scream. "What is?" the reporter asks. She approached the silhouette. Before she could get close, the form in the fog abruptly moved, the mist quickly billowing towards Kenna before the reporter was lifted off of the ground. Kenna's thoughts were not coherent. All she could be aware of were what felt like fingers as cold as ice around her throat. The pressure tightened, harder and harder, until she could feel an explosion of pain, blood, and collapsing trachea in her throat. There's a flash of unbearably intense pain. Then Kenna is on the ground. People are screaming and running. The one light in the fog topples over, and the camera crumples. Both the footage and the light cut off, and everything is dark. Kenna barely notices. She's trying desperately to take breaths through a shattered throat. She feels her chest soak in a warm liquid and wonders what it could be. The cameraman appears, yelling, trying to tell her something as he hovers over her, looking terrified into their surroundings. Something was surrounding them, but all Kenna could see was fog. Before she can see what the cameraman is looking for, Kenna Spears loses consciousness and dies on the 4th day of her exciting new internship. The cameraman does not notice. At the moment of her death, the same icy cold fingers wrap around his throat and drag him, kicking but unable to scream, deeper into the fog. In the next few hours, the entire town of Maylene went into lockdown. A few bodies belonging to those unlucky enough to be outside of their homes and around the school that morning, including the sheriff of Maylene and his 2 deputies who had been keeping a close eye on Richard, are unseen in the dense fog. The attack had taken place early enough in the morning so that only 20 or so children were at Maylene Elementary. They had all been quickly evacuated to the library. They'd all waited, but help didn't come. Richard Childs was alone in an empty classroom while Evelyn waited in the library. The room offered no comfort. The minuscule desks and chairs looked odd with the brightness of the lights and the darkness outside. Colorful stickers of various objects with cartoonish eyes seemed to glare at him. Sitting in the teacher's chair and putting his head on the desk, he did his best to ignore everything else and draw 5 pointed stars on a blank piece of paper. Except all that he saw was Madeline. He wanted to be in the library, wanted to be with his daughter, but it was better this way. Better to be here alone than to stress out the kids old enough to recognize the man on the news who had abused his now deceased wife. Or was she? The thought kept coming back to him. That's what Evelyn had said. It had been her. His mind had already been strained for years. He thought it had snapped after he found Madeline's body sitting against the tree in the front yard, smiling spitefully even in death. Everything's gonna be okay, he told Evelyn as they both sat in their house waiting for the cops to arrive. It was a paper-thin platitude, and they'd both known it. He said it again when the sheriff led him to the squad car. The pitying look Evelyn had given him as he was handcuffed made him want to rip his hair out and scream. To hell with the news cameras and reporters watching. Those promises, the lies, had caught up to him. As he stared into the shifting darkness outside of the classroom window, it made a sort of karmic sense. The lies had replayed in his head since he'd been interviewed by the sheriff. "I love you" had been the first. He'd said it after his and Madeline's first kiss. She'd been expecting it after all, wouldn't want to disappoint his first love. She told the same lie to him every time the fighting had died down, and they lay on the bed or couch. Sometimes she'd even cry to show him how remorseful she felt after treating him the way she did, promising she'd get help and start treating him better. But after Evelyn had been born, Madeline had gotten physical. Richard picked himself up, wiping his puffy eyes with the back of one hand and putting the pencil he'd been doodling with in the other, and left the classroom, deciding that he didn't care how others thought of him. He wanted to be near Evelyn. The stepping of his shoes echoed around him as he walked towards the library. The lights were off, the dark brick hallways seeming out of a nightmare. What if those things, her, made it into the school? But that was impossible. He and the teachers had made sure there was no getting into the building. Right. Even that much was assuming anything about this situation was logical. At the library door window, he could see that most of the children were collected on a large rug that displayed Earth's continents. A few teachers sat on chairs around the kids, forming a protective circle. Kids and adults watched a tape of Schoolhouse Rock. There were stickers everywhere of flowers, rainbows, and books with large cartoonish eyes that looked haunting in the dim TV glow. Evelyn was at the back with the older kids, and she was the first to see him. "Dad," she said, so loud and abruptly that everyone in the room jumped. She was up and running across the room, everyone watching her in stunned silence. She threw open the door and hugged his waist. "Are you doing okay?" he asked, kneeling down to be eye to eye with his daughter. "Not really," she said with heartbreaking exhaustion. "Are you?" "Yeah," he said, hoping it was true. "Miss Clausen wants to talk to you," Evelyn said, pointing to the teachers sitting at a table in the corner of the room. "Okay, sweetie, sit tight." He wasn't sure which one was Clausen at first, until he saw the oldest woman sitting at the far end of a long rectangular table with a particularly harsh glare aimed right at him. She motioned for him to join the teachers at the table. Each of the teachers gave him varying degrees of caution as he found a seat. Some just seemed cautious. Most looked outright hostile. Doing his best to ignore them, he sat down and stared at the table, not knowing what to do with himself. He felt all of their eyes boring into him. "Mr. Childs?" asked Ms. Clausen quietly, easily the oldest teacher at the table. She was a beady-eyed and permanently scowling woman that Richard could tell kept as tight a grip on her classroom as she could. Yes, he did his best to smile, but only barely managed to soften his frown. "Did you kill your wife?" For an instant he was back in the sheriff's tiny interrogation room. The deputies crammed uncomfortably behind the sheriff's desk, all three looking like they'd pulled in a psycho murderer after a rampage. They'd put him in a small chair against the far wall and made sure to constantly let him know that, no matter what it looked like, he had been free to leave at any time. "No." The teachers all glanced at each other, as if a bit surprised the homicidal maniac they'd built in their heads could speak. He supposed this was fair. He hadn't spoken to any of them when they'd been making sure the school's doors were locked. "Did you beat her?" Another teacher, this one a man in his late 30s, asked very timidly before remembering that he was supposed to be acting as an adult parental figure, before less timidly adding, "The news said there were bruises. Bruises on her wrists and shins," Richard finished. "She left a lot more bruises on my gut and back from the effort, I promise." "Why was that?" Clausen asked. He could feel the tendons on his neck stretch as he bit his tongue, anger flooding into his veins as he remembered everything Madeline had done. The anger wasn't even towards the teachers or the sheriff and his deputies when they had asked. It was towards himself. "She liked to fight," he said when he'd relaxed himself. Clausen held her gaze. "Care to explain what you mean, Mr. Childs?" "No." The teachers all shared shocked glances. This whole thing was starting to prickle his nerves. "Look," he said, "I just wanted to make sure everyone was all right. I sure as hell didn't come here to get interrogated again." "Mr. Childs," Clausen said, her face softening just enough to show Richard that behind the gruff, stern exterior was an old woman who was desperately tired and scared for the children in the room. "We just want to make sure you aren't a risk to the children." It was clear that some of the teachers, specifically the prissy young man who'd spoken up earlier, still weren't convinced that he wasn't a threat. That was fine with Richard. He didn't give a shit what they thought. "That only leaves me with one question, Mr. Childs," Noreen said, rubbing her eyes. "Do you have any idea what in the Sam Hill is going on?" "No," he answered honestly. It was still hard to believe anything that had happened was real, but he'd seen the reporter's throat bulge as something lifted her from the ground. And what Evelyn had said. "It's her. My daughter says she saw it," he said. "Whatever did that to the reporter? She said the thing looked like her mother. I believe her." "That's insane," the young male teacher said. "You're insane." "Mr. Benson," whispered Mrs. Clausen, so sharp and so loud that most of the kids glanced toward the adults at the table. Mr. Benson squirmed into his chair. Richard had thought Clausen's eyes had been beady and penetrating before. Now they were sharp enough to make the most behaved college senior wither. "You forget," she continued much more quietly, "that I saw the murder happen myself. That before the murder happened, some of the kids were talking about adults walking around the school that none of the teachers could see. Do you doubt me?" "No, Noreen," Benson stammered. "I just don't think it's logical to." "Benson," Clausen said, "you said you were the only one to see what happened to the cameraman. Is that still true?" Benson went pale, so pale that Richard thought that all of the blood might have drained out of his face. "Putting that aside," Clausen said very pointedly towards Benson, who shrank even farther back into his chair, "we need to find a way to contact the authorities. It's clear they—" Richard felt something at the very edge of his senses, a feeling. The others at the table must have heard it as well, They'd all gone quiet and pale with quizzical looks on their faces. Richard turned in his seat to get eyes on Evelyn. She was looking towards the windows. All of the children were. The light of the TV cast shadows around their faces as they looked, as if wearing dark masks to hide their terrified expressions. Ghosts, an older child near Richard whispered, like white statues. The younger children began to cry. Outside, several shapes had begun to move through the fog towards the windows. The mist clung so tightly as they moved that a myriad of human silhouettes could be intuited. At the front, moving very fast and energetically between the windows and foggy figures, was Madeleine. Richard didn't know how he was sure. Maybe the wisps trailing her figure in the fog was just distinct enough for him to tell the shape of her. Regardless, he was sure. That was her. Mom. Evelyn. She stood next to him, looking at the figures. The animated figure stopped, and Richard thought he could see its head move toward the sound of Evelyn's voice. "Why?" Evelyn asked. A puzzled look, not only from Evelyn, but also from some of the kids nearer to the windows. "That doesn't make sense," Evelyn said. "I thought you said." Evelyn reached towards the glass as she spoke. Richard was about to stop her when the windows exploded. Everyone in the room screamed. Richard threw himself in front of Evelyn, tried to tell her to run. Warm fingers closed around his throat, cutting off his words. The teachers rushed to push the kids against the furthest wall in the library. The kids were still screaming so loud that Richard couldn't hear himself think. From his right, Clausen and Benson ran to him, throwing their weight into whatever held Richard. Both crashed into the invisible figure like a wall, the grip around Richard only getting tighter. At one point, he saw Benson jab at the thing with a very sharp pencil. It exploded uselessly. A few of the other teachers fell onto the invisible thing choking him, but each of their blows bounced off. Richard remembered his own pencil that he put in his pocket earlier from his time in the other room, collecting himself. To hell with it, he thought. Even if it was a useless effort, he wasn't going down without a fight. Not anymore. He gripped the pencil so hard it almost snapped and stabbed it towards the fingers on his throat. The pencil hit its mark and went deep. Cold, unseeable liquid spilled over his hands. Before he could go for another hit, his vision went crazy and his body went weightless. The back half of his body slammed into something hard, knocking what little air was in him out of his lungs. "Mom." "No." When his vision had just barely begun to refocus, he saw something fly out of the windows that had just been broken into. Evelyn screamed as she was pulled into the fog and out of sight. The other figures in the fog followed, all floating silently while the sound of Evelyn's scream faded. The shortest walk to where Evelyn's screaming had trailed off, the teacher's parking lot, was through the combination auditorium/gymnasium. The exit was one he'd locked himself when they'd been sweeping the school when this all started. Why didn't Madeleine come through then? She easily could have if she was powerful enough to shatter the library windows. Was this all a part of her game? Her amusement? Had she purposefully given time for him and everyone else to be terrified and at her mercy before she took him to hell with her? It was likely, he realized as he found the exit and took his first step out into the fog. Even when they'd been kids, she'd lauded any sort of victory she could over him. Back then, it had all been in good fun, hadn't it? The mist crawled through the dark doorway behind him. The air was cool, damp, and had an odd metallic taste to it. The drizzle that had been over the town for days was gone, but it had left a very wide, very thin pool of water that covered the entire lot. He couldn't see all of it, but what he could reflected the mist into a gray mirror that lay flat across the lot. His feet almost seemed to be stepping into a void of mist that rippled at his every move. Richard felt he should be scared, but he wasn't. Not at first. His instinct to get his daughter back overrode everything else. It only waved when he saw feet-shaped holes in the water at the very edge of his limited vision. There was a quick motion, more ripples on the water, and then the feet were facing away from him. He could see the black tar-like surface of the lot under the feet-shaped holes. Fear was in him then, rushing back into him as he encountered more and more foot shapes in the water. Whenever any came even slightly into his limited visibility, there would be a quick motion that sent cascades of ripples across the mirror he seemed to stand on, and then the feet would be pointing away from him. There was Evelyn, standing rigid and silent as far off in the fog as he could see. Splash, 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 splash. Something slammed into his back. His vision blurred as his body fell forward and slammed into the ground, his head and stomach slamming hard into the pavement. The air in his lungs was squeezed out of him. Instinctively, he tried to pull air back in, and his throat was met with gravelly rainwater. In a daze, choking and spitting, he raised himself onto his knees. The fog around him was all at once nauseating and hard to get a grip on. It felt like he was in hell. Playing with your toys, huh, Maddie? He stood, straining his ears for the same splashes she'd caused before. It was almost impossible. Every time he turned his head, the other invisible things turned away, causing ripples and splashes that overtook any of Madeline's, if she was even making any. Something slammed into his shoulder. She was in front of him now, and easy to track. But what now? She could bleed, even if it was impossible to know what she bled. But how could he get to her and Evelyn without putting his daughter in danger? A shame that our last fight would be to the death. It was probably what she'd wanted. Why she'd done whatever she had done to get an army of figures in the mist to do her bidding. Even if he was going to die, he'd hoped there was a way to be sent off flipping that bitch a middle finger. There was a humor in that he was still playing into her game. Humor. That's it. It was so simple. He laughed. It started slow, forced, and horrifying in its own right. He forced a laugh anyway, all of his chuckles almost sounding like sobs. A memory came to him. The looks Madeline had given whenever he went out with coworkers without her permission. The annoyed glances when Evelyn had chosen to be with her father instead of her mother. Even the frown he would see on Maddie's face whenever he found good company, away from her, at family parties. The fake, horrible chuckles started to come out easier. Boy, I tell you, Richard said to himself, if I took my wife to a dog show, I think she'd win first prize. Now he was really laughing. So hard that he thought he wouldn't be able to get air back into his lungs if he tried. There was nothing to laugh at before, but now there was. Whatever the white things were, whatever Madeline had done to bring her and them here, was a fickle, easily manipulated thing that was not only beyond Richard and Evelyn's understanding, but of Madeline's as well. Dad? Evelyn asked, her fear entirely overshadowed by her shock. She was about to say something else when her eyes went wide. She looked around where the ghost stood in the water. On the other side of the school, Noreen Clausen was finally getting a connection to the police station on her cell phone. Benson was nearby standing with the other teachers in front of the kids, all of whom had been packed into the corner like it was a standard school lockdown. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a few of the kids look towards the windows. None of the figures in the mist had followed them to the room, but Benson's nerves still froze. "What is it?" he asked. "People. Laughing," one of them said. Benson strained his ears. He heard nothing, but at the very end of his senses, for just a second, he thought he could feel something. Richard couldn't hear laughter besides his own, but like Benson had, he felt them. All of the other white things that had come for him with Maddie, they were laughing with him. Straight ahead of him, two of the footholds turned towards him. Madeline. He watched her take a few steps around the other invisible things, all of who were still facing away from Richard as they laughed. He could picture her looking at what she thought had been her allies, or even just her temporary companions, with bewildered rage. In one last deliciously petty move, he put one hand to his straining stomach, and the other pointed at her. By then, he was laughing harder than he ever had in his life. Suddenly, the footsteps were thundering towards him. Every step was heavy and clumsy, spraying water all over the place. A lot of the water hit the invisible white things, and rivulets of water ran down them, giving them shape. His laughter stopped. Richard's hand went to his pocket and back out just in time for his late wife to make contact. The choice for weapons in a school library had been almost non-existent, and why his attack had hurt her when nothing else would remain a mystery to him forever. But it was all he had. 3 sharpened pencils. Again the pencil sank in, and he felt the cold liquid run down his fingers again for an instant before the full weight of her crashed into him, sending them both crashing into the ground. He tried to breathe in, and almost did, before a force that could only have been Madeleine constricted and pushed on his entire body. I'm going to die. A part of him was ready to die. That part of him wanted nothing more than to let something that he'd continued to ignore and, in a way, foster, just let him rest. Let him finally be done with everything. Dad. Seeing black spots in his vision, he brought his hands from their awkward angle underneath his back and wrapped them around Madeleine's invisible form. Get, he said, his hands gripping her head. The hell. He stood, lifting both of their weights off of the ground, slowly and struggling but surely. Out, he took the second pencil from his pocket and hammered it into the invisible form's throat. It disappeared into her, all the way up to the eraser. Of my life. With one last effort, he threw her away. Madeleine's body hit the ground hard, making a crater the shape of her body in the water. The other foot-shaped craters in the water turned towards Madeleine. Madeleine raised her arm, the water instantly pooling into the empty space as she lifted it. It fell back in with one last pathetic splash. Evelyn ran into him then, wrapping her arms around and burying her face in his jacket. She was crying too, but quietly, keeping her eyes just dry enough to watch her mother leave for the final time. It happened very quickly. One moment the body-shaped crater was there, then it wasn't, filled with the reflective rainwater that still covered the lot and still filled with dozens of white things, all pointed towards Richard and Evelyn. Then, without a word or sign of any kind, the figures in the water turned away from them and the school and left. Their steps were silent, and their ripples were many. The image of their craters forming in the water as they walked away and into the fog was one that never left Richard or Evelyn. I still have nightmares about my mother, I told my friend Zach on a frigid October night in downtown Mystic. She's running through the Darien jungle from a man dressed head to toe in camouflage. His face is shadowy and deformed. I can't see my mother's face, but I can hear her scream. Zach's face was as pale as mine, flushed with goosebumps. I don't know what to say. I kept the rest of the dream to myself because it was too terrifying to put into words. I never met my mother or even saw a picture of her. In my dreams, however, I saw her braided hair, mestizo, skin, and unblinking brown eyes so vividly that I felt like I had met her many times before. For years, I had the same dream and sinking feeling that the man chasing her was my father. Advertisements. You don't have to say anything. I'm just letting you know before. Is that why we're? I nodded. Why can't you just tell me? If I told you, you wouldn't have come, I said firmly. He shrugged as we passed Mystic's iconic pizza restaurant. The streets were surprisingly sparse for a Saturday night so close to Halloween. Only a dozen groups of people, including a noisy, argumentative family, passed through the quaint shops, eateries, and bars. Advertisements. You've been sounding a lot like Jordan lately. I grimaced. If you had the experience I just had, you'd believe in the supernatural too. I'm sorry, he said shakily. You and Jade went through a lot last month. How is she? I paused and studied Zach's expression to see if he was genuine or asking out of obligation. His glassy, darting blue eyes let me know he cared but was weary and anxious about the night ahead. I longed to tell my anxious friend more, but didn't want to scare him off. I lured him to Mystic on the pretense of needing help with a family issue, which wasn't completely a lie, but enough to make him come along. For a long time, Zach insisted on helping me learn more about my biological family when other people, including the woman I called Mom, insisted I live and let live, especially after the ancestry test I sent away for had muddled results at best. Zach was the only friend besides my ex-girlfriend who supported my continued search for answers. He was the only friend who listened to my dreams and didn't attempt to psychoanalyze them. Unlike the others, he didn't give me some clicked bullshit about my real family being here. If he knew what I meant by family, however, he'd leave me astray like the rest of my friends. I thought briefly about inviting Jade along, but despite her immense capacity to care, I didn't want to burden her after her recent stay at a psychological trauma clinic. My problems seemed minuscule by comparison. They bothered me endlessly, however, and I didn't want to face them alone. She'll be in therapy for a while, but she's doing better. I'm so glad. Are you trying to get back together with Sorry? Never mind. How are you doing? I'm okay, but I'm not telling you anymore until we get there. What's the harm? You dragged me out here, Miguel. Do you think I'm going to head back now? Where are we? Okay, fine, I said, stopping in front of a shoddy brick apartment building. From my jacket pocket, I withdrew the white envelope that someone left on my doorstep 2 days prior. Ink markings covered the body of the envelope. The markings looked like deer tracks, but were broader and had rounded front toes. Somewhere in the distance, a seagull cawed. Zach glanced briefly into the sky, and then unfurled the note inside, his eyes squinting, then widening. The pig man wants his piglet back. What the hell? It looks like a serial killer wrote it with all the letters cut from magazines or something. When did you get this? A week ago. I pulled my jacket over me as a cool breeze chilled my bones. I know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I posted a pic of the letter on a message board. A woman who went by Blue Wolf 77 sent me a link to the legend of the pig man and said she was a victim. What the hell is that? I glanced over my shoulder as a woman carrying a tote bag from the Black Dog store shuffled past us. It's unnerving. Sometime in the 70s, a group of teenagers saw a woman being drowned by a man with a pig-like face and never resurfaced. The woman DM'd me and let me know she was the victim and got the note too. She invited me to this place too. You? Really, Miguel? This is why you dragged me here. I'm here to support you, but ugh. Never mind. What does some folk tale from the 70s have to do with you, and how do you know you could trust her? The night after I got the note, I had the same dream, but this time, I could see the man's deformity, his pig-like snout. It was terrifying. Also, I don't know if I could trust her, but she sent me a picture of the note she received. It had the same. Look, I don't even have to look at you to know you think I'm crazy. You are crazy. Let's just go inside. I knocked on the outside of the metal door before realizing where the buzzer and intercom system was as I pressed the lone button. Zach muttered, I can't believe you think a pig man is your daddy. I snarled as the voice of a late middle-aged woman answered, Yes. It's Miguel Boyd. Before I could say anything more, I heard a buzz and an unlatching of the door. I opened the door to a dimly lit hallway lined with torn sculpted carpeting. Despite the building being multi-leveled, the staircase wasn't accessible from this side. There were only 3 rooms and a Mr. Pibb machine at the end of the hallway that looked like it hadn't been working for years. The first 2 rooms were unnumbered. The last door, numbered 1C in faded black script, was left cracked a few inches, the TV glow flickering through its crevice. I hesitantly opened the door. Zach, who was checking something on his phone, followed. It's nice to see you, the late middle-aged woman said from behind a rustic wooden table. Next to her sat a balding man in an oversized cape-back shirt. Across from her sat a woman with beautiful almond eyes and silky black hair draped in a blue duffel coat. They looked no older than their late 30s or early 40s. Even the woman known as Blue Wolf 77 had traces of red in her silver hair. Her broad shoulders gave off the impression that she was well preserved for her age, and maybe athletic too. I see you brought a friend too. Don't you have a seat? Okay. We took the two lone chairs at the far end of the table. The three of them stared blankly at us. The glow from the old boxy television was the only source of light in the room, which felt quite crowded with the large sectional and half-kitchen intersecting it. My name's Donna Michelson. Next to me is Devon, and across from me is May. Like you, we all received the same note. They subtly waved at us as Donna laid the notes on the table. Each note had a similar style of lettering, but Donna's had blood-smeared hoof prints across the body. "Who sent these to us?" I asked, trembling. "And why did you invite us here?" "They're a cult," Mai said softly. "An old cult. We don't know where they are, though," Devon gruffly followed. "We know exactly where they are," Donna said, slamming a palm atop the table. "We don't need to speculate. They're called the Miracle of the Swine. They have roots all over the world, including several chapters in the States, Eastern Europe, Asia, and even South America. They have a church near the Bascule Bridge a little ways from here. I can't find anything online about them," Zach said, looking up from his phone. "I found some Bible verse about God exorcising demons from humans to swine, though. It's really not everything you can find online." Donna's words were cold along with the atmosphere in the room. Devon and Mai were tough to read, practically stoic as if they were numb from some untold trauma. They've been around for years. "I'm sorry. What does this have to do with me? Why are you telling me all this? Why did I get the note?" The others looked off to the side as the woman sighed. "In those messages, I asked you about your background for a reason. When you told me you were born somewhere in Venezuela, it took me back to when we had a chapter there. Your mother or father must have been a member. I don't know how to put this gently, but they're going after survivors and their offspring." Wait. How? How do you know this?" My fingers were trembling. Zach and I wore the same pale expressions. The others were stone-faced. I was a member. As for Devon and May, their fathers were members too. Donna got up from the table and headed over to a hanging shelf over the television set where several photo albums resided. Standing upright, she looked nearly 6 feet in height, which took me by surprise, and Zach too, based on his expression. I shuddered at the thought of the type of monster that could bring this woman to her knees and attempt to drown her. She pulled a bright textile album from the middle column and laid it on the table. It read, PCCAROI. There were different chapters all over the world. We were the Peccary chapter, she said, opening the album to the page of 3 men and 2 women standing in front of a domed hut surrounded by sugarcane crops. The crops towered over the hut. My eyes locked onto the woman with mestizo skin and braided hair. Zach pointed frantically at a man with a bulbous head and glasses. They were all wearing brown, dirty robes with hoof print patterns. That was me, and those men were May and Devon's dads, Richard and Vic, the best of friends. "What's wrong, boys?" "That looks like my Uncle Cliff," Zach said faintly. "He was my dad's brother, and we didn't talk much about him." "That looks like the woman I dream about," I followed hesitantly. Donna, tracing her fingers over the man and woman, replied, "It very well could be. He went by a different name back then, Larry. Many people changed their names when they left the cult. And this, Miguel, is Daniela. She could very well be your mother. We lost touch because we left the next year to set up a chapter in the States. I'd like to think they escaped." I turned to Zach, whose eyelids were twitching. "Is that your uncle who's in the asylum and doesn't speak?" He nodded. "They could be your mom and uncle, but we don't know for sure. We set up a chapter in upstate New York after we left. By then, Richard, Vic, and I escaped to our families." "Why did you escape?" As Zach asked this, we were all stone-faced, staring as Donna struggled to find her words. Her eyes were miles away, her face draining paler and paler. "That year, we moved up far enough in the ranks to discover the actual rituals. They made us wear masks of pig faces, only the material was real, carved from the animal skull. They said we were all God's swine and needed to cast our demons out of ourselves and onto a herd of pigs, the lower order members. What did that mean? I asked hesitantly. Human sacrifice. Tears welled in Donna's eyes, but for only a brief moment as she composed herself. We all escaped to our respective families. I lived with mine in Mystic for a while, until they found me. They tried to drown me under the bridge. I escaped, but I know they've been looking for me since, and this letter confirms it. I've managed a bed and breakfast down the street for years. I've tried to get on with my life, but now they're looking for us because they got to our dads a few years ago, May muttered. What do you expect us to do? We have to stop them, Devin said, his lower lip trembling. They are not only going after the survivors, but their offspring and possibly even nieces and nephews. What do you expect us to do? Zach repeated in a slightly more mortified way. They sound incredibly dangerous, and if they are right in downtown Mystic, why don't we just report them? Donna laughed, turning over her letter. For the first time, I noticed some indescribably small font that I had missed the first time. Don't you think we've tried that? They've evaded the authorities for years. There's only one way. The note says the pig man wants his piglet back. On the back, mine says, return them to the sty or die. Who is the pig man? We asked in unison, not knowing if we'd dread that answer. I wanted desperately to ask about my dream, but knew it wasn't the time or place. I wanted to ask if he could be my father, but wondered if he would be too old. Their leader. Beyond that, I don't even know, she said hushedly. She turned to the last page of the album, which held a lone photograph of a mass crowd wearing pig-faced masks. Some of them held torches, others nooses. He never spoke, and we never saw him. But in every service, the chaplain mentioned him as the father of Sty. This is crazy, Zach said, standing up from his chair. Look, Donna, I believe you, but what you're asking from us is way too dangerous. I'm sorry. Just as I nodded and stood up as well, Devin put an arm around my shoulder. Mai stood by the door, not blocking it, but folding her arms. We understand. May's voice was soft-spoken, her even softer eyes gesturing for us to sit down and stay. We don't blame you at all if you leave, but we don't want any more victims. Our dads died a senseless death. Zach, your uncle didn't deserve to go to an asylum, and Miguel, your mom shouldn't have had to endure what she did. I appreciate that. We nodded and sat back down in our chairs. Donna hugged both of us and whispered thank you before sitting back down herself. What were they like? I asked, almost teary-eyed myself. If they were who we think they are. Daniela didn't speak much English, but she was a beautiful soul and a wonderful artist. Donna unrolled her sleeve, revealing a hemp bracelet with beads of many colors. She made these all the time in the compound. When we joined, we thought it was like the Peace Corps. We thought we were truly helping people like her. And Zach, Larry, was clumsy as hell. He couldn't do any of the manual labor, but he was a sweet man and a hell of an accountant. I hope it's her, and I hope she's okay. I mumbled. I must have been loud enough for Zach to hear as he nodded, saying the same about his uncle. Daniela looked unmistakably like the woman in my dreams. My mind was racing. What hell did she go through to escape? How was she able to give me up safely? Most importantly, where was she now? Devin turned the page to a picture of Richard and Vic sitting under a massive nut tree. He and Mai looked mournfully at the photograph of their smiling, young fathers adorned in those foolish robes. My father was a man of few words, but a damn good man, Devin said, leaning into the table. He was a damn good lawyer, too. He and Vic went into law together, representing survivors just like them. Mai sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. They were the best attorneys and won plenty of cases. They fell upon tough times, and sorry. She took a moment to compose herself, wiping tears away. Look, Devin leaned in even more, slanting his eyebrows. They fell upon tough times, and the cops found them dead in their office about a year ago. They ruled it a suicide, but they wouldn't do that to their families. There's no way. There was no note or anything. Donna hugged both of them and whispered hoarsely, "They didn't kill themselves. They were set up. I'm sure of it. Not another person will be hurt under my watch." Zach and I exchanged worried glances as Donna adjusted something underneath her jacket. Donna rose from her chair and headed to the door. "We will attend a gathering tonight. There's another old building outside of the Bascule Bridge. Zach, it won't be as dangerous as you think, not if we follow the proper protocol." With those words, we followed Donna into the cold, sparsely populated streets of downtown Mystic. We walked in silence, lost in thought. I could tell Zach was thinking about his poor uncle. For me and Devin, their trembling lips let me know that they were just as uneasy about this plan as we were. They seemed to trust whatever the plan was. Donna, on the other hand, kept her fists clenched in her jacket pocket as we trudged on toward the even older brick building. When we arrived at the brick building, Donna approached a dimly lit hole in the wall shop. A wooden sign hung over it with the words Divine Crafts etched in black font. White doves were perched on the D and C, respectively. Next to Divine Crafts were closed shops with suspiciously similar names, Ezekiel's Bakery and Wise Men Books. We didn't know if the shop was open until we saw a bald man in a flannel shirt and wire-framed glasses sitting, nodding off at an old stamped metal cash register. "Good evening," the man said, eyes widening as we all stepped into the quaint shop. There were shelves lined with biblical figurines, clay molds of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, as well as some glass mugs of the Garden of Eden. The rest of the molds I didn't recognize, even though I spent the better part of my childhood in Sunday school. "What brings you here so late?" "Looking for anything in." Donna lay her note on the counter next to the register and motioned for us to do the same. Shakily, we piled the notes on top of one another. "The piglets have returned to their sty." "Shit," Zach said aloud. Luckily, I was the only one who heard. "He's been waiting for you." The shopkeeper's demeanor turned from glee to complete graveness as he dimmed the lights in the shop to a low glow, flipping the "open" sign on the door. The man led us to a door adjacent to the bathroom, labeled Storage. He opened the door to a switchback staircase that wound into complete darkness. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of us. We hesitantly stepped inside the small space, trying to gauge Donna for any type of lid. She was glancing down at her shoes, fingers clasped, as if she were ready to pray. Zach and I looked at the others who were doing the same and uneasily followed suit. With our heads cast down, I became increasingly aware of my breathing as the man placed a white cotton robe over my head. I dared not look up as he slipped something over my face. I was too panicked to scream as a mask tightened over my head, engulfing me in complete darkness. It felt tough to the touch, almost leathery, with tiny hair follicles brushing against my constricted skin. 2 slanted holes perforated enough room for me to barely see from. 2 smaller ones below enabled me to smell the foulness of the mask, an unsettling mix of sweat, and the slight scent of manure. It took all my willpower not to vomit into the mask. As it is written in the book Matthew. The man's voice reminded me of the old bellowing priest I nodded off to for many Sundays as a child. It was somehow both calming and downright haunting. When Jesus arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. We are all those demon-possessed men. Tonight, we wear the flesh as a symbol of the swine Jesus cast their demons into. Amen. All of us except Donna whispered Amen in equally terrified tones. Donna, however, said it loudly, the way she probably had for years. Our collective group was now adorned in pig masks and white robes. We looked like we were heading to a Halloween party or extras from a horror movie. The realness of the ceremony hadn't struck me yet as we followed the shopkeeper down into the darkness. From the eye holes, I could see even less in front of me and accidentally bumped into Zach, who was shaking from the waist down. I could hear him hyperventilating through his mask. This was no place for my friend with an anxiety disorder. Equal amounts of regret and fear washed over me as we stepped into a long and narrow room, lined with people in their robes and masks who sat stiffly in their wooden chairs. The piglets have returned to their sty. The shopkeeper bellowed in a tone that sounded creepily joyful. The robed parishioners stared straight ahead, completely unfazed by his announcement. He gestured for us to take the seats in the last aisle as he made his way to the front of the parishioners. As we sat, Zach and I briefly looked at each other, as if we were wondering the same thought about him being the pig man. Then we looked up frightfully at the shopkeeper as he stood between two lone torches fixed on metal braziers. There was a hand-carved totem pole behind him with a large round figure punctured atop the pole. The figure was too eclipsed by shadows for us to see. This return and our sacrifice tonight will please our Father in heaven, as well as our Father of sty that awaits us tonight. We seest our demons unto them. The words of the parishioners and Donna echoed through the hollow room. I didn't look at Zach, but could hear the sound of his seat rocking back and forth. I put an arm around his shoulder to calm him, and he apologized under his breath. As chaplain of our faithful sty, I declare unto thee that our sacrifice is good, and worthy of our Father's lovey, they chanted. The chaplain stepped aside to reveal a wooden totem pole carved into the long body of a pig in varying shades of pink and tan. Atop the pole sat what looked like the head of a brown boar. Only, underneath the head was a human neck with blood dripping from its endings. The four of us cocked our heads, trying not to vomit. Donna subtly adjusted something under her robe. Now we invite our brothers and sisters of this holy gathering, the miracle of the swine, to receive our Lord's miracle. The parishioners lined up behind one another to take an offering from the head. We lined up behind them, trying to mimic their stiffened posture. One by one, they touched the nose of the boar, sliding their fingers down to its bloody neck. Once a parishioner rolled his or her finger in the blood, the chaplain kissed their forehead, and they returned to their chair, their bodies showing almost no emotion. When Donna reached the front of the line, she stepped toward the pole and placed her left hand on the head, running her finger down to the bloody neck. With her right hand, she pulled a black object with steel framing from underneath her robe. "Your days of sacrifice are over," Donna said coldly, pointing the threaded barrel from a Glock at the chaplain's head. A collective scream rang out among the parishioners as they ran toward the staircase, knocking over chairs and falling over each other. We were too fright-stricken to move as she fingered the trigger. "You and the pig man have destroyed too many lives." The chaplain let out a low, hoarse laugh as Donna unlatched the safety. "Our Father of sty will be pleased." "You foolish woman. Did you forget the most important verse? When Jesus cast the demons into the swine, he told them to go. So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water." Suddenly, the torch flames dissipated. This was followed by the sound of Donna's clock hitting the floor and firing as it slid across. We screamed collectively as the spark of gunfire briefly ignited the room. Then there was pitch blackness. In the blackness, we heard the monstrous sounds of grunting and squealing. The others gasped as the snorts became more audible. One by one, they collapsed to the floor. I knew I was next as I felt a warm, moist snout press against my neck. The snout oinked and oozed cold, sticky liquid down my shirt. It had the awful texture of mucus and saliva, which caused my chest to shudder. Something about the liquid made me feel dizzy and nauseous. Within seconds, my consciousness slipped away, and I collapsed too. When I awoke, I could feel the scratchy bristles of a rope constrict my arms and legs. I was still wearing the awful mask. Through the eye slots, I could see the wooden planks from a dock and the frigid water flowing below. As I turned to my left, I saw the others tied and masked, and two large black, cloven hooves tapping as they stomped down the planks. We must have been by the docks near the bridge. I couldn't move, however, as the oinking and grunting sounds echoed into the night. The pig man's hooves stomped and clicked by my head. "Are you my father?" I hesitantly asked the creature, absolutely bewildered by the words that preceded my thoughts. There was a long silence followed by a heinous chuckle from the chaplain. "Foolish child," the chaplain spat from behind us. "While the father of Sty is a father to all of us, or was in your case, your mother was a common whore, so no one knows who your actual father is. Unfortunately, she escaped our faithful Sty with that lunatic Larry. Oh well, Larry is locked up as all deranged sinners should be, and she probably died the way that all traitorous whores do. Fuck you," I shouted into the mask, which was followed by a swift hoof to the ribs, almost toppling me into the water. "Not yet, Father. We haven't said the words of our offering yet. Blessed are we to free thine demons tonight." As the chaplain spoke, a lone torch illuminated the docks. From his left hand, I could make out the outline of an axe. In the year of our Lord, 1963, our Father of Stee made the ultimate sacrifice to embody the demons and pigs that Jesus sacrificed. We are eternally grateful, and for him, we make our sacrifice to save the souls of men. The chaplain waved the axe over our heads. In the air, he carved the symbol of the cross. He proceeded to carve the symbol 5 times as the pig man stomped his hooves in unison. The chaplain swung the blade especially close to Donna's head, purposely slicing a few hairs that stuck out. I felt the warm snout press against my neck again and snort twice. Then the pig man, hooves clicking, loomed over the others and did the same. Behind us, the chaplain thumped his torch in tandem with the grunting. He stomped over to Donna, clicked his hooves, and grunted 3 times. The creature pressed a cloven hoof into Donna's back. In one fell swoop, Donna arched her body upward and somersaulted backward, knocking herself and the pig man into the water. Devon followed suit and rolled backward toward the chaplain, knocking him and his torch into the water. The torch extinguished, and the chaplain's hands dangled helplessly above the waves. There was no sign of Donna or the pig man, but we could hear the submerged squeals, which permeated the waters around the dock. As the axe dangled on the edge of the dock, he sliced the rope from his arms and legs. Devon sprang up and tore the mask from our heads. Then he came around to each of us and freed us the same way. We gasped loudly as we helped each other to our feet. We looked around frantically for Donna, the pig man, or the chaplain, but by now, only the sound of crashing waves and the frigid October wind remained. From the dock, we could see the dimly lit bascule bridge, which not a single car traversed. Downtown Mystic's quaint businesses were dark as well. Not a single soul strolled the sidewalks. I was surprised to find my phone still in my pocket. It was midnight. "Donna!" Devon and Mai shouted. After a few bouts of coughing and hacking, Zach and I echoed their cries. "Donna!" Devon sighed and looked somberly at the waves. Then, clutching the axe, he angrily threw it in the direction the chaplain sank and screamed, "Never again!" at the top of his lungs. We huddled around Devon as the axe sank into the water. "We should call the police," Mai said shakily. "Please do," Zach cried. "This is way too insane, guys." Before we could say anything else, Donna burst out of the water holding the thrashing hooves of the pig man. Donna gritted her teeth as the hoof kicked her face. "Run," she hollered. "If the police find you here, you are an accessory to what I'm about to do and what Devon already did. Fucking run." The pig man squealed from beneath the waves, a squeal that echoed into the depths of the waters and the night. We ran up the dock and onto the street as fast as we could. As Zach tripped by a bench, me and Devon sped out of sight. I swore and helped Zach to his feet as the squealing grew increasingly louder. In the distance, we heard the sounds of sirens, which caused Zach and I to pick up speed, breaking into full sprint mode. The sound of the sirens and the pig man's squeals echoed with equal measure as we sprinted over the bridge. As we entered the downtown area, we were practically wheezing as we passed the iconic pizza restaurant. By now, the squealing had stopped and the sirens faded in the distance, Halfway up the steep road, we stopped in front of the only building with a light on it. It was a quaint two-story house painted brightly blue with a slanted roof on top. The sign for the building read, "The Blue Jay Inn." We exchanged puzzled, exhausted glances and then stepped inside. "Let's lay low tonight. I'm not in the state of mind to go home yet," I whispered as we stepped into the carpeted lobby with beige puff sofas. He nodded and mouthed the words, "I don't either." His entire body was still trembling. Mine was too. A smiling, elderly woman greeted us from behind a stainless steel desk. She was typing something into a boxy computer. "You're out late tonight, fellas. Do you need a room?" "We do," I said hoarsely, desperately. The woman checked us into a single room with 2 beds on the second floor. After she gave us the key card, I ushered Zach, who could barely move a muscle, up the stairs and into the room, slamming and bolting the door. Zach slumped down on a neatly made twin bed, rocking his body back and forth, his eyes fixed on the floor. I sat down next to him and slung an arm around his shoulder for a few minutes. Throughout our many years as friends, I learned how to calm my buddy down from an anxiety attack. I never learned how to ease my attacks, though. "We have to tell someone. We have to tell someone," Zach repeated, rocking increasingly more intensely. "The cops are already there. Donna is too. She'll tell them everything. What if she didn't live? What about me and Devin? What about—" I shushed him gently. The words that followed were to reassure both him and me. "Donna's a strong woman. She'll be okay, and so will me and Devin. Let's go to sleep and figure out what to do in the morning." On the top of the bed, Zach fell into an anxious sleep, his body shaking tremendously as he dozed off. Even when he snored, he shook. I pulled a cotton blanket from the closet and placed it over him. Over the hour, Zach's body relaxed, and so did mine. When I was sure he wouldn't wake again, I pulled out my phone to find 3 missed calls from Jade. Before those calls, I realized that I had pocket-dialed her around 11:30 for about 5 minutes. When I pressed Jade's number, she picked up immediately and shouted, "Miguel, what the hell happened?" "Jade, I don't even." I heard screaming, shouting, and I think even oinking. I called the police. "Are you okay?" "I am now." Deep into the night, I told Jade every excruciating detail about what happened to us. She cried and swore several times, and so did I as I spoke about my mother and Zach's uncle. As we spoke, Jade waited for anyone from the Mystic Police Department to call her back, which they surprisingly never did. I waited for a call as well. My adopted mom would have flipped if she heard from an officer. About a couple hours into the conversation, as Zach started snoring and shaking again, Jade realized that she hadn't provided the officer with Zach's name or mine. She only indicated that her boyfriend and friend were in trouble, which made me blush. By the break of dawn, Jade had fallen asleep by her phone. I whispered good night, love, and hung up as she drifted off. It was already 6 o'clock by the time I heard people rummaging in the dining room downstairs. I didn't mind that I spent the night divulging every terrifying detail. We had both experienced trauma now, and somehow we would get through it together. I feared for Donna, though, as well as Devin and Mai, who were hopefully far away from Mystic by now. I feared for the parishioners, too. What would become of their lives? What would become of our lives? With these questions rattling through my mind, I crept downstairs as my poor, anxious friend dozed the morning away. As I made my way into the dining room, I noticed a couple about the age of Jade and me looking up from a laminate table at a broad-shouldered woman in black pants and a white-collared shirt. Silver hair with traces of red draped over her shoulders. I stood in the doorway, jaw agape, as she handed them a tray with a stack of thickly sliced ham. The portions were more like slabs of steak than ham. The couple salivated as she placed the tray in front of them. "You came just in time, folks. This ham was freshly made, courtesy of our chef, who prepared and glazed it last night." "Oh, wow," the man exclaimed. "I've never seen slices this thick before. It's like he slaughtered it himself. The three of them laughed wistfully as a surge of vomit crept up my throat. My name is Joshua, or Josh for short, and I'm dead. It took me a while to come to this realization and to recall the circumstances around my death. It wasn't easy facing up to the truth, but I've since come to terms with it. Some of you might be familiar with my story if you've read my previous accounts. If not, I guess it's pretty simple, really. I made a terrible mistake, and people suffered as a result, and I had to pay the price. I wasn't sent to hell. I could well have ended up there, so I suppose I should count myself lucky. My temporary home was a crumbling and decrepit apartment building inhabited by a motley crew of bizarre individuals. This wasn't hell, but I guess it was some kind of purgatory. Every one of my neighbors was dead, and we all had our stories to tell. The complex we were trapped inside was anything but pleasant. Still, compared to what sat beyond our walls, the building was a sanctuary. Nobody ever stepped outside of our building. Some had tried in the past, from what I'm told, but it never ended well. Spooky narrative audiobooks. The outside was eternal night, nothing except for darkness under a ghostly pale orb. Our building was surrounded by a shadowland, inhabited by unspeakable monsters and sadistic demons. As bad as it was in there, the outside was far worse. And I should know because I'd already seen these vile creatures in action. But to be honest, I thought little of the hellscape after we first arrived in this realm. Because I wasn't alone in there. There were three of us living inside of this small and squalid apartment. Three souls tied together in death, for better or for worse. Sally is my ex-girlfriend. More than that, actually. She's the mother of my child. But I didn't discover I was a father until it was nearly too late. My second roommate was Milo, the man who I'd killed in a drink-driving incident prior to my own death. I'd never faced justice for this crime on Earth, because Sally and I conspired to cover up Milo's death. Pretty screwed up, right? The three of us had been through a lot together, having literally fought through hell side by side. Still, the close confinement, boredom, and constant stress and anxiety gets to you in such a place. I don't know how long we'd been inside before the tension started to get to us. It was difficult to keep track of time in that realm. All I know is that the arguments became more frequent between the three of us, and we had few friends in this realm. The three of us were newcomers in their home, and we weren't trusted. The block warden was a man called Marcus. He did his best to keep the peace, but it was a tough job, and I could see him fast approaching breaking point. I watched this poor guy with his sullen eyes and pasty skin and wondered what hell he'd lived through to arrive in this place. But whatever his story was, Marcus wasn't for sharing. I vividly remember the night when the first incident occurred. There was something foul in the air that night, a stench even worse than the black mold which infected the building. I remember having this foreboding feeling as I lay down on the hard mattress, staring up at the ceiling as I struggled to get some sleep. Sally lay beside me in the dark. My ex had nodded off about an hour before, although she remained restless, talking incoherently in her sleep as the nightmares invaded her subconscious. I didn't know what was going through her mind, but could hazard a guess. Our son was lost somewhere out there, on his own in an unknown level of the afterlife. Our boy had died alongside his mother in a freak car accident. I'd never even met our son, but still it pained me to think of him all alone. But I could only imagine what Sally was going through. For a mother to be separated from her infant child, I couldn't imagine a worse hell. I watched Sally suffer in her sleep for a while, covering my ex with a blanket and kissing her gently on the forehead. We weren't back together, and our relationship in there wasn't romantic. I felt no physical desire for her, and don't think it was possible to do so in that purgatory. But the love we'd once shared together, those feelings hadn't gone away, even after death. I didn't think I could sleep that night, but finally I did drop off due to sheer exhaustion. But my slumber was anything but peaceful. Nightmarish visions invaded my dreams as suddenly I was back in the line, surrounded by snarling demons and trapped between heaven and hell. And then I was returned to the car, sealed in at the bottom of that damned lake, as I smashed my fists against the windscreen in a futile attempt to break out. Once again, I was mesmerized by the dark water surrounding me, but terrified by the wide-eyed predators which swam in rings around my sunken vehicle. Nightmares such as these were all too common, unfortunately, but what followed next was a horrifying first. I shot up from the mattress, gasping in air as my whole body dripped with cold sweat. I'd awoken suddenly in a state of acute panic but couldn't say why. Disturbances were a frequent occurrence in this building, with bumps in the night happening around the clock. But this was something else. I looked down upon Milo for a moment and felt a mixture of emotions. Life would be a lot easier if Milo wasn't here, but Sally and I owed him a massive debt. He said he'd forgiven us for taking his mortal life, but as time went on, I wondered. I saw the looks he shot Sally and me, and noted all the times he'd snapped at us. Frankly, who could blame Milo for holding a grudge? But there was more to it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I reckoned Milo was hiding something from us. He rarely spoke about his mortal existence, other than occasional references to his wife. Sometimes I wondered whether Milo really was just a random hit-and-run victim. But our roommate posed no threat on this night as he remained fast asleep. I scanned the living room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps I was just being paranoid. But no, I had to trust my instincts. Slowly but surely, I made my way across the living room floor and reached out for the ragged curtain covering the window. With considerable reluctance, I drew back the curtain, only to recoil in horror at what I saw. On the far side of the thin glass staring in at me was a huge eye. Its white sclera a good 3 foot in diameter and black pupil as large as a dinner plate. I gasped, covering my mouth with my hand to prevent myself from screaming. The horrifying giant eyeball took up most of the window, and I was unable to see the full form of the gigantic monster it belonged to. I don't know whether I was paralyzed in fear or trapped under the beast's wicked spell, but I couldn't move from the spot or avert my eyes from the demonic eye. It didn't blink or move, but I knew the beast was watching me. Surely a creature of this size could break through the window with ease, and yet it didn't. Instead, it just stared for, I don't know how long. There's no telling how it would have ended. But suddenly I heard movement behind me, turning in time to see Milo rising from his slumber. I could only watch as my companion adjusted to his surroundings and saw the giant eye staring in at him. "What the hell?" he cried in disbelief. This prompted the beast to react, as it let out a banshee-like wail so loud it drowned out all other sounds. I fell to my knees and covered my ears in a vain attempt to drown out the horrific din. There were footsteps behind me, and I saw Sally out of the corner of my eye, her face filled with pure terror. But my attention remained on the window as the monster's foul wailing ended. I expected it to attack, but mercifully this didn't happen. Instead, the beast seemed to be spooked, since it retreated from the window and flowed back into the Shadowlands. Against my better judgment, I darted forward in the hope of getting a decent look at the peeping monster. In truth, I could make out little in the darkness, but the beast had the shape of a giant bird with a long and sharp beak and unnaturally large eyes, perhaps evolved so it could see better in the dark. It retreated awkwardly across the dead ground upon long, stalk-like legs, which looked too thin and flimsy to carry its weight. Nevertheless, the beast moved quickly and soon disappeared into the darkness, leaving no trace of its unwelcome visit, and I turned back towards Milo and Sally, all three of us in a state of shock and unable to utter a single word. I met Marcus the next day. I suppose it would have been morning, except the sun never rose in this hellscape. The block warden was anxious. I could tell as much as soon as I saw him. We met under the dim strip lights in the staircase, whispering in the shadows so not to be overheard by the other residents. Marcus smoked like a chimney, looking over his shoulder nervously as he listened to my account. I noted the heavy bags under his eyes and reckoned the poor man mustn't have slept for some time. Perhaps he wasn't permitted to ever rest in this hellish realm. I certainly didn't envy the job he had in there and reckoned it must have taken a toll on his sanity. Nevertheless, I told Marcus my story, describing the encounter with the saucer-eyed beast who'd stared into our apartment window. Marcus didn't comment as he listened intently whilst nodding his head solemnly. There was a lengthy pause after I finished giving my account, as it appeared Marcus was deep in thought. In the end, I had to prompt him. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. Marcus looked me in the eye, and I saw the pain and suffering he carried with him. He sighed deeply before eventually replying. "This has always been a pretty weird place, Joshua. There's always an underlying danger and threat in the block. But there were also rules. I kept the peace as best as I could. And we survived, always waiting for the end of our respective sentences. Ours was a tough life, but it was just about survivable." "So, what's your point?" I interjected impatiently. Marcus shot me a look, clearly angered by the interruption. I should have known better than to provoke a man on the edge. "My point is this," he answered through clenched teeth. "Things are changing around here. The creatures who stalk the Shadowlands, they've always been out there, but they never came close to our building. That's all changed now, as you've witnessed." Marcus lowered his head and broke off eye contact before continuing in little more than a whisper. "And there's been other incidents too. Shadowy figures walking the corridors, packs of harpies attacking the wire mesh, pale-skinned demons jumping over the rooftops. This isn't a safe place anymore, Joshua. I don't know how long I can keep it together." I felt a cold chill run through me as the terrifying reality hit home. "I don't understand," I said nervously. "What has changed? Why is this happening?" Marcus raised his head, his lips forming into a half-grin as he answered. "You did. You and your two friends arrived, and suddenly the whole place went to hell. If you'll excuse the pun." I ignored Marcus's attempt at dark humor, feeling incredulous at his accusation. "You think we're responsible for all this?" I exclaimed defensively. Marcus shook his head. "Not me, but the others are talking. They're scared and want somebody to blame. For what it's worth, I'm trying to talk them down." He paused briefly, looking over his shoulder once again before he next spoke. "I can hold them back for now, but if there's another incident, some of the residents are genuinely dangerous. Hastings, daughter Marshall, just watch you back, Joshua. That's all I'm saying." My anger subsided somewhat when I realized Marcus was actually trying to help us. I was still scared, of course, but at least Marcus had given me the heads up. I held out my hand for the block warden to shake, a small act to show my appreciation. Marcus seemed shocked by the gesture, staring at my extended hand in puzzlement for a moment. But finally he shook, and I noted how his palm was ice cold. Marcus went to leave, but I still felt I owed him one. I placed a hand on his shoulder as he turned, watching him flinch at my touch. "Hey man, are you doing okay?" I asked sympathetically. Marcus didn't meet my eye, however, pulling away and continuing up the staircase. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. "I'm just having some trouble with my TV reception." I didn't know what he meant, but Marcus wouldn't elaborate as he disappeared up the stairs and retreated into his apartment. As it happened, we didn't have to wait for long until the next incident inside the building, the crisis which brought it all tumbling down. The three of us were sitting down to have a meal at the small dining table off our living room. This was Sally's idea. It was a ritual more than anything else. We were dead and so didn't need to eat. And the slop we had in front of us came out of a can and was far from appetizing. I played with the gruel on my spoon, not wanting to put it in my mouth. But then I glanced across the table and saw disapproval in Sally's eyes. I'd seen that look before. This was important to her, and so I needed to play along. So I lifted my spoon up to my lips, placing the food inside my mouth before I started to chew. Sally smiled with satisfaction as she took a spoonful from her own bowl. "This is nice," she said rather unconvincingly. "It's good to get back to some normality." I smiled and nodded, not wanting to break the illusion. But Milo wasn't playing ball. He scoffed in contempt, spitting out his food and dropping the spoon down on the table with a heavy thud. "Remember your table manners," Sally exclaimed. "Are you kidding me, lady?" Milo shot back angrily. "You really think we can play happy families in here? After everything that's happened? Are you crazy?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Sally beat me to it. "For God's sake, Milo, what's your problem? I know it's rough in here. We're all hurting, but we've got to make the best of it." Milo shook his head in disgust, and I could tell he wouldn't back down. He glared at Sally, and then at me, holding my gaze with hatred in his eyes as he snarled through clenched teeth. "You know, I thought I could forgive and forget what you both did to me. But I didn't think those sick bastards would stick me in here for the rest of eternity, trapped with the same assholes who killed me. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't want to break bread with my murderers." I lost my head at this point, shouting out as I stood up from my chair. "Damn it, Milo. How many times? It was an accident." Milo stood up then, and so did Sally. We were all screaming at each other in a blazing row. I reckon it might have come to blows, but we had far more to worry about than domestic squabbles. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, going from stifling heat to ice cold in mere seconds. I saw the instant change in Sally and Milo, their eyes widening in all too familiar terror as both looked over my shoulder. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I slowly turned my head, only to come face to face with a monster sitting upon our worn-out couch. My eyes bulged and jaw dropped as I surveyed the beast who'd inexplicably invaded our sanctuary. The demon was the size and shape of a fully grown man, but it certainly wasn't human. The genderless creature was perhaps 6 foot in height, its skin a deadly shade of pale white. Its fingers were unnaturally long, and its nails were formed into razor-sharp talons. The demon's eyes were jet black and soulless, but the smile on its crusty lips was anything but friendly. It shot us a sadistic grin which showed off its rotten, yellow teeth, but its stare was truly terrifying. A killer's gaze through dark and shark-like eyes. I was frozen in terror for a long moment, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, this couldn't be, because Sally and Milo could see it too. I didn't know what to do, but suddenly I felt a firm hand on my shoulder as Milo whispered in my ear. "Don't look at it. Don't react to its presence," he explained. "It feeds off our fear. Ignore the bastard, and it will leave." Milo's instructions sounded crazy to me, but he had more experience with these demons than I did, so I decided to trust him. Against all my instincts, I turned my back on the monster, once again facing the table and my now terrified companions. I could hardly breathe as I felt the beast's hard gaze on the back of my head. "Just pretend like everything's normal," whispered Milo. I looked to our companion in astonishment, but he met me with a stern look. "Everything is normal," he repeated through clenched teeth. Next, I glanced across at Sally and was alarmed to see her shaking almost uncontrollably. Her skin turned as pale as milk. I didn't know how we'd get through this, but Milo was taking charge. "You know, I was wrong, Sally," he said aloud. "This is a good idea. Nothing quite beats a sit-down family dinner." With this said, Milo took a spoonful of gruel and put it into his mouth. This actually brought a smile to Sally's lips, even though her eyes were still filled with terror. I wondered whether Milo's insane plan might actually work, but then I heard the low guttural growl from behind me, closely followed by the sound of claw-like talons clicking on the hard wooden floor. The sweat poured down my brow as I listened to the demon walking across our apartment floor. I couldn't see the beast, but knew it was slowly marching towards our table. "Don't turn around," Milo whispered whilst retaining a fake smile on his trembling lips. "Don't look at it, and don't react, no matter what happens." The demon was right behind me now. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, and the foul stench it emitted filled my nostrils. It took everything I had in me, but I managed to keep my head down and avoid the monster's eye as it circled the table. But Sally wasn't so lucky. She raised her head for just a moment, meeting the demon's hideous gaze for mere seconds, and that was all it took for the monster to latch onto her. I watched on in horror as the demon stood over my ex, extending its elongated fingers as it reached out to touch her cheek with its hideous talons. Sally was frozen in terror, her body trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. This was more than I could stand. As my protective instincts took over, I shot up from my seat and screamed at the monster, shouting, "Don't you dare touch her." In an instant, the demon left Sally and turned its attentions to me, its sadistic grin widening as its dark eyes focused. The attack was so fast I couldn't react. It's all something of a blur in my memory, but I know the monster grabbed hold of me, its claws digging into my chest and making me scream in agony. The monster enjoyed my suffering as it snarled aggressively. It was so strong and I couldn't resist. Before I knew it, my body was lifted off the ground, and I was flung across the room like a rag doll. I hit the wall hard, collapsing to the wood floor as the force of impact knocked the wind out of me. Sally screamed and Milo jumped up from his chair, but there was nothing they could do for me as the demon approached, its maw open and talons outstretched as it prepared to attack. I thought I was a goner, but just then I heard a crashing from the hallway as our front door was kicked in. Heavy boots followed, and a moment later 2 armed men piled into the room, weapons at the ready. I looked up and recognized my neighbors coming to the rescue. Marcus was armed with a double-barrel shotgun, whilst Hastings carried his trusty crossbow. Both men had a fiery determination in their eyes, only hesitating for a moment as the beast snarled aggressively in their direction. Hastings fired first, shooting a bolt into the demon's shoulder. It howled in pain, but didn't go down, prompting Marcus to empty both barrels into the beast's torso. Boom! Boom! The din of the gunfire was near deafening, and the cartridge smoke filled the room. The beast was flung backwards, its hide pierced by buckshot. It fell against the wall, and for a moment I hoped it was dead, but no such luck. Our enemy was hurt but still moving. Cornered and scared, it dashed forward towards the door. Marcus and Hastings just managed to jump out of the way as the monster tore past them, fleeing into the corridor and out the front door. Marcus and Hastings promptly reloaded before chasing after the beast. Meanwhile, Milo and Sally ran to my side and helped me to my feet, and the 3 of us followed our armed neighbors out onto the balcony. We ran out just in time to see the demon leap upwards with tremendous speed and power. Looking up, I saw our attacker smashing through the thin wire mesh, which separated our inner courtyard from the dark skies above. Next, it jumped onto the building's roof, making heavy footfall as it tore across the tiles. Our neighbors opened fire, but the demon was too fast, and soon it leaped off the building and disappeared into the dark abyss of the Shadowlands, making good its escape. We'd survived the demon's assault, but only by the skin of our teeth. The ruckus and gunfire had alerted our other neighbors, as one by one the apartment doors shot open and a motley assortment of frightened and angry souls stepped out onto the balconies and courtyard below. Most of our neighbors were present. Widow Jackson sheepishly poked her nose out of her door, forever nervous and on edge, as her eyes scanned the balcony. And Mr. Jones was on the ground floor, looking more curious than anything. But that Dan dog was with him, fighting against the leash as it barked maniacally up at the dark sky above. Cerberus was the mutt's name, and his owner called him a pet. But Jones's animal was the size of a large wolf and definitely not domesticated. And then there was Driver Marshall, who sauntered out of his front door and onto the balcony across from us, blood on his shirt as his dark eyes surveyed the scene with a predatory zeal. It chilled me to look upon the so-called doctor. I didn't know exactly what he did inside of his apartment with those special deliveries from management, but the foul smell from his flat and the blood which seeped through the ceiling told a story. There were others too, neighbors who kept to themselves in this hellhole, just more lost souls serving their sentences for undisclosed sins. I scanned their faces and saw nothing but stress and fear. It seemed the entire community was on edge and one incident away from breaking point. It was Hastings who spoke first, turning towards the 3 of us with anger evident in his cold eyes. "You damn people, He spat. "You brought this trouble in with you. What the hell are you talking about?" Sally shot back in confusion. "I'm afraid he's right, dear," said Marshall, as he shouted across the divide. "These disturbances have only increased in frequency and severity since the arrival of your group." There were murmurs of agreement from the other residents, and I could tell the crowd was turning against us. Marcus tried to argue in our defense, setting his shotgun down against the railings as he raised his hands defensively. "Come on, guys," he said in a less than convincing manner. "This isn't the way we do things in here." "Things have changed," Hastings said firmly, his hand still firmly clutching hold of his crossbow. "What do you suggest we do?" Marcus asked nervously. "Cast them out," came the cry from Marshall. "Let them take their chances in the Shadowlands." "You can't be serious," Milo shouted back. But the mob was rapidly turning against us as a chant went out amongst our frightened neighbors. "Cast them out! Cast them out!" they repeated in unison. I looked to my companions and saw the shock and terror in their eyes. Marcus went for his gun, but Hastings pulled the crossbow on him. "Don't do it, old friend," Hastings warned. "You need to let this happen." The crowd started to move menacingly along the balconies towards us. The three of us backed off fearfully. I thought we could seal ourselves inside of the apartment, but didn't think we'd last for long. Marcus continued to try and talk the mob down, but a moment later his eyes were drawn upwards. I saw the warden's face turn even paler and wondered what had spooked him. "Dear God," he said whilst pointing upwards. "Look." Hastings grinned inanely as he continued to aim his crossbow directly at the warden's chest. "Come on, man," he snarled. "Do you really expect me to fall for that?" But Hastings should have listened. I heard the sound of scratching and tearing followed by the high-pitched shriek of something horrifying. Glancing up, I saw a red-scaled and winged monster crawling along the wire mesh and heading straight for the newly created hole in our thin protection. Its dark eyes lit up and its maw opened to reveal the sharp teeth within. Hastings heard the shriek and reacted quickly, but it was already too late. He managed to fire a single bolt high and wide before the bloodthirsty harpy dived on top of him, burying its claws and teeth into his body. The man screamed and struggled, but the winged demon used its immense strength to lift him off the balcony, still gripping a tight hold of its victim as it ascended with wings outstretched, soon exiting through the same gap it had entered and soaring into the starless sky, taking the still screaming Hastings with it. We were all frozen for a moment in shocked horror, our previous disputes forgotten as we faced this new and deadly threat. And the attack was just beginning. Harpies always hunted in packs, and many more followed the initial incursion, using the gaping hole in the wire to gain access. The apartment complex was no longer safe, and all hell was about to break loose. Terrified residents attempted to flee back into their apartments, but few made it that far as the winged demons descended upon them, literally tearing their victims to shreds in a bloody slaughter. Chaos ensued as several things happened at once. There were a series of loud bangs from inside Widow Jackson's apartment. The woman screamed as she ran back into her flat, saying, "I'm coming, Johnny. Don't be scared, baby." At the same time, a trio of harpies launched a brutal attack upon Mr. Jones, but Cerberus was there to protect his master. The wolf leaped into the path of the first demon, biting deep into its throat with all the fury in hell. The harpy shrieked in agony as the two beasts struggled on the ground, but the demon bled out within seconds. But meanwhile, the other two harpies attacked Mr. Jones, grabbing him by the arms as he screamed and struggled. Cerberus wasn't done fighting for his master, though, as he leaped upon the second demon and tore at its wings. But it was too late for Jones, as the final harpy took hold of him, digging its claws deep before ascending. Cerberus barked desperately as he watched his master being taken, but the slaughter continued unabated. My attention was drawn back to Widow Jackson's apartment as a huge man charged out onto the balcony, screaming manically as his wild eyes scanned the corridor below. He must have been 6 foot 6 inches tall and heavily built to boot. although I noted how he wore childlike pajamas which were several sizes too small for him, giving the man an almost comical appearance. I assumed this was Widow Jones's errant son Johnny, who'd been confined to his bedroom until now. The man-child saw the demons feasting upon his neighbors and panicked, sprinting heavily along the balcony and heading for the staircase. Mrs. Jackson chased after her son, shouting his name frantically as she went. But sadly, the long-suffering woman didn't make it far, as a harpy descended upon her from above and pulled the shrieking lady upwards in a rapid and merciless attack. Events continued to move quickly as a pair of bloodthirsty harpies flew towards us, their vast wings flapping whilst their dark eyes focused upon us, their intended prey. Luckily, Marcus was alert to the danger, aiming his shotgun and firing twice. Boom! Boom! The buckshot tore through the winged demons, shooting them out of the sky. I watched with relief as the monsters fell down to the courtyard and reeled in agony on the cold ground below us. The imminent threat was neutralized, but we were far from safe, as the monsters picked off our neighbors one by one. "We need to get back inside," Sally said. "No," Marcus replied firmly. "We must get to the lobby. It's our only chance." We followed the warden's lead, running for the staircase as Marcus reloaded his weapon. I tried my best to drown out the awful din of the victims' screams and demons biting into flesh, instead looking to Sally and taking her hand as we descended. We soon reached the dimly lit lobby with its cracked tiles and moldy walls. I don't know what Marcus had planned next, but the situation was still developing. Johnny was using all his considerable might to beat against the inner door, eventually smashing through. He then proceeded to pound on the second reinforced door, which was all that now stood between us and the Shadowlands beyond. We watched as the strong man attempted to break out, but the door was too strong for him alone. Suddenly, we heard a growl and the ominous sound of something big tearing down the stairs behind us. We darted out of the way as Marcus raised his gun in anticipation of another attack. But it wasn't a harpy coming down the staircase, it was Cerberus. The huge dog ignored our party as it charged through the lobby and headed straight for the door. Cerberus struck the door with all his considerable weight and the combined strength of the dog, and Johnny forced it open. We were suddenly hit by a cold wind as our final defense from the Shadowlands was breached. And before we could do anything, both Johnny and Cerberus fled out into the darkness, heading in opposite directions. The man screaming and dog barking manically, as both unwittingly ran into a hostile land. Marcus lay down his shotgun as he rushed forward, shouting something about barricading the entrance. But he stopped dead in his tracks when a figure emerged in the doorway, stepping out of the shadows so we could see his face under the flickering strip lights. I froze when I saw and recognized the entity who had shaped my journey through the afterlife. He might have been a ghoul, demon, or perhaps even an angel, with swirling vortexes in the place of eyes, smiling menacingly as he stood in the doorway, whilst wearing a full tuxedo and bowdy, thus appearing entirely out of place in this grim hellscape. I think all my companions knew who he was, Marcus included. I had never learnt the entity's true name, and had simply christened him as the Dark Man. All I knew was that he held immense, but not total power. But perhaps he could decide our ultimate fate. All four of us stood frozen to the spot as the Dark Man entered the lobby, the soles of his shoes clinking against the tiles as he came. At least I assumed there were only four of us. But I jumped in surprise upon hearing a familiar voice from behind us. Ah, our patron. Such a pleasure to receive a visit from management. I turned around and came face to face with Driver Marshall, a thin and unnerving smile etched across his pasty cheeks. The doctor had somehow survived the massacre on the balconies, more's the pity. I wanted to challenge him, but my attention was drawn back to the Dark Man as he spoke out in a booming voice. "Gentlemen and lady, I'm glad to see you all made it through our latest test. Time is of the essence, so let me cut to the chase. This complex is no longer viable. You cannot stay here and must move on." "Move on? How?" Marcus asked. "You will leave through this very door and walk the Shadowlands. The dark man answered. Are you crazy? Milo shot back. Those monsters out there, they'll kill us. The dark man's grin widened, and he made a point of standing aside and pointing out into the darkness. And in front of our very eyes, two lines of white light lit up, a pathway leading through the Shadowlands and out towards the distant horizon. I felt the cold chill of déjà vu as my mind was thrust back to the terror I'd experienced after death. Some of you have faced this test before, the dark man explained. The others will learn soon enough. It's simple, really. All you need to do is stay inside the white lines and walk. Nothing can hurt you as long as you stay within the lines. Keep on walking until the end, and then you'll all face your final fate. There's nothing more to it. Why should we? Sally demanded. We've all suffered enough already. I don't want to play your games anymore. The dark man didn't miss a beat as he calmly responded to Sally's outburst. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, madam. This structure will cease to exist in the very near future. You must walk the line or face the Shadowlands without my protection. Believe it or not, I am trying to help you. Sally didn't have an answer to this. I heard her making that nervous clicking sound with her tongue, and this reminded me of our past life together. No one spoke in the tense moment which followed, and I believe we all made a collective decision. The dark man turned to leave, offering us a final piece of advice before he disappeared into the dark abyss. Stay focused on your objective, stay in the lines, and work together. These are the rules that will see you through. And with that, he stepped into the shadows and vanished without a trace. We all stood in the lobby for a long moment, speechless and unsure of ourselves. We knew what had to be done, but I think the four of us were reluctant to take the first step. But Dever Marshall held no such inhibitions as he stepped forward with a spring in his step and spoke jovially. Come on, folks, you heard the man. There's no time like the present. To my astonishment, the twisted physician marched out into the dark wasteland without a hint of fear, acting like he was simply going for a stroll in the park. I shook my head, thinking that Marshall must be completely insane. Nevertheless, he had taken the lead, and we all had to follow. And so the four of us reluctantly stepped across the tiled floor and towards the doorway. I hesitated at the last, as every instinct in my body told me not to step outside. In the end, it was Sally who persuaded me, taking my hand and shooting me a sweet smile that reminded me of better times. However, there was a steady determination in her eyes as she spoke. We need to do this, Josh. It's our only chance of getting back to Kevin. I thought of the son I'd never met and the fact he was all alone out there, and this gave me strength. Sally stepped out first, and I followed. Milo was next out of the door, and Marcus was the last to leave. We walked single file within the lines, trudging through mud as a cold crosswind hit us. We could see little beyond the light emitted by the lines, but still I glanced nervously into the dark abyss and feared what monstrosities might be lurking in the shadows. I guess we only walked a couple of 100 yards before the ground started to shake. Turning around in a panic, we saw the artificial lights in the ugly apartment block extinguishing all at once. A moment later, and the building itself began to sink into the mud, collapsing under the ground as a massive sinkhole swallowed it up. Before long there was nothing left, as the hole sealed itself, and no trace remained of our former home. I can't say I was sorry to see the prison go, but I noticed how Marcus stood for a long moment, sighing deeply before he finally turned away and left the past behind him. Advertisements. Our walk was a long one, the tension and fear only increasing the farther we progressed. We could see virtually nothing in the darkness, as even the pale orb in the night sky was eclipsed. But we could hear them, the invisible monsters who ruled the Shadowlands. They knew we were intruding on their turf, and would surely like nothing more than to rip our bodies to shreds and feed upon our entrails. The low growls and predatory roars came from all around us, but the hidden demons and unidentified entities couldn't get to us, as the line offered protection. Still, the creatures were surely following our progress. We could make out their dark shadows and hear their heavy hooves trudging through the mud. Like all predators, they were searching for weaknesses, for one of us to step out of line where we'd be exposed and vulnerable. But we kept our cool and obeyed the golden rule: stay inside the lines and keep walking. Our next test was more of a challenge, however. About halfway along the line, we heard a most unexpected and unnerving sound coming from the shadows, one which brought a cold chill down my spine, but almost broke Sally. It was the noise of a baby crying somewhere off in the distance, faint at first, but growing ever louder. Sally stopped dead in her tracks as her eyes widened, and she listened intently. "Kevin," she said, whispering at first, but soon raising her volume to a frantic cry. "Kevin, it's Mommy. I'm coming for you, baby." I had to act quickly, reaching out and grabbing my ex just before she stepped over the line. She fought fiercely, but I retained my tight grip. "Let me go, Josh. That's our son out there." "No, it isn't," I screamed back. "It's a trick, Sally. They're trying to draw us out." I guess she had to fight all her maternal instincts, but Sally finally listened to reason and stopped struggling. She continued to walk the line with the rest of us, quietly sobbing as Kevin's cries faded away. This was only the start of it, however, as our ears were assaulted by cries and pleas for help from the darkness. It seemed that whatever demonic entity was hunting us could mimic the voices and tones of our relatives and loved ones, attempting every trick in its repertoire to try and lure us out. We heeded the dark man's advice and ignored the ghoulish calls, but they took a heavy toll upon our collective sanity. 4 of us were evidently very distressed, but not Dr. Marshall. He seemed fascinated by the terrifying situation, looking out into the shadows with an almost childlike excitement, which I found very disturbing. The depression hit soon after. I felt the darkness creeping inside of me, a deep despair and guilt as every bad memory and negative emotion came flooding to the surface. I believe the others were affected in the same manner. And then the confessions began. The crime committed by Sally and I was already common knowledge. But Marcus let it all spill out as he tearfully recalled the accident which had resulted in the deaths of his wife and 2 daughters. They'd died in a house fire caused by a cigarette butt he'd carelessly dropped. The warden's story was tragic for sure, but I was more interested in Milo's confession, as our companion finally opened up to us. "You never asked why I was walking on the roadside after dark. You know, the night you guys hit me," he began solemnly. Sally and I both glanced back, although Milo would not meet our gaze. "I had a big fight with my wife and stormed out," he explained. "The truth is, I treated her badly. I let her down. I stopped walking and turned around to face my unlikely companion, feeling a renewed sympathy for the man we'd wronged. 'You made mistakes, Milo,' I said. 'It doesn't mean you deserve all this.'" A long pause followed before he next spoke. "There was more. I did some really bad things." I was hooked by this point, temporarily ignoring the terror all around us as I waited for Milo to elaborate. But his confession was interrupted by Dr. Marshall, who called back along the line with his own unwanted story. "You know, folks, I never actually killed anyone during my mortal existence. All my experiments were conducted on the recently deceased. I was caught in the act, and that was the end of my medical training. Things spiraled out of control, and sadly an opioid addiction ended my life. I always believed I was on the cusp of greatness. That's what was robbed from me." Nobody had any response to the doctor's disturbing admission, and I was annoyed by the interruption, because Milo had lost his nerve and he wouldn't reveal the full extent of his sins. I don't know how long we'd been walking for, but it seemed like miles trekked along the seemingly endless line. The voices stopped and even the depression lifted. We were all physically and mentally exhausted, but I dared to hope the worst was behind us. Unfortunately, the next threat was not one I'd anticipated. Dr. Marshall was still leading the march at the front of the line, until suddenly he stopped dead in his tracks, turning slowly to confront us. I saw his face illuminated by the white lines, and was chilled by the sadistic grin on his lips and the dark intensity in his wide eyes. Sally stood between Marshall and me, but I instinctively pushed past my ex and put myself between her and the doctor. "What are you doing, Marshall?" I asked nervously. He chuckled dryly before offering a cryptic answer, and the look on his face was one of pure madness. "I hear them speaking to me, calling out from the shadows," he explained. "They say I can be with them, that they'll show me wonders beyond human imagination and allow me to reach my full potential. They'll give me everything I've always wanted, and all they need in return is a sacrifice." I tensed up as I realized that danger was imminent, but Marshall moved much faster than I could have imagined. He struck me hard with a sucker punch and I went down, my nose bleeding as a sharp pain shot through my skull. I landed in the mud as Marshall leaped over me and grabbed hold of Sally, using his arm to place her in a tight headlock. Next, Milo shot forward and attempted to save her, but Marshall lashed out and pushed him away. I fought through the pain and pulled myself up, but Marshall had already stepped out into the darkness. I went to chase after them, but Sally called out to stop me. "You have to go, Josh," she screamed desperately. "Get to Kevin. He needs you." I stood frozen in shock, impotent as the woman I'd once loved was dragged into the darkness, and both soon disappeared into the great unknown. "Get up. It's coming for you," came the sudden cry. That was Marcus, but his warning wasn't directed towards me. I looked over to Milo, who lay in the mud where he'd fallen, only to realize our companion was outside of the lines. Milo tried to crawl back, but it was already too late. Suddenly, a huge tentacle-like appendage shot out from the darkness and grabbed Milo by his leg, squeezing tightly before beginning to pull. Milo screamed and fought, but it was all over very quickly, as the unseen monster dragged him into the abyss. My body trembled and tears rolled down my cheeks as I searched in vain for my companions, hardly believing what had just occurred. But then there was a firm hand on my shoulder and a sympathetic word in my ear. "I'm sorry about your friends," said Marcus, "but we need to keep moving." I nodded my head in painful agreement as the two of us slowly continued our march to an uncertain fate. The remainder of our walk was unnerving, as the ravenous beasts closely followed our progress. But we weren't going to slip up again. Both Marcus and I knew what was at stake now, and we wouldn't fall for their tricks and traps. We trudged along for some time before finally reaching the end of the line, only to see nothing but a dead end, as the white lights abruptly stopped, and there was nothing in front of us except for a dark and empty wasteland. I fell to my knees and felt like crying out in blind fury. But then there was a powerful burst of light before us. I was temporarily blinded by the intense illumination, until eventually my eyes adjusted and I observed an extraordinary sight. The darkness of the Shadowlands was now replaced by two portals which sat at the end of the line. On the left was an inviting white light, and to the right stood a swirling vortex of blood red. My jaw dropped, but I was understandably cautious, because I'd played this game before. "Two portals," stated Marcus as he walked up beside me. "I guess it's an easy choice for us." "Don't believe it," I replied knowingly. "This is a trick." "Not this time," came the call from the darkness. I recognized the dark man's voice straight away, but I couldn't see him in the shadows. It hardly mattered, however, as the supernatural entity was merely present to deliver his final instructions. "No more tricks, gentlemen. This is the end of the line, literally in this case. The portals are exactly what they appear to be. The light leads to a better place, and the vortex to somewhere less pleasant. I am sorry, gentlemen. You've come so far, and I'd hoped to free you both, but sadly it's out of my hands. Only one of you can pass into the light. The second must enter the vortex and go to that other place, for a time at least. I can't make this decision for you, gentlemen. You'll need to resolve this yourselves." And that was it, the dark man's final test. I felt sick to my stomach, hardly believing the situation they'd put us in. I was so sure it would come down to a fight between Marcus and me, a final desperate struggle fought in the mud and darkness. I turned to face the warden whilst expecting the worst, But I was surprised to see a sad resignation on this face, as Marcus smiled faintly whilst placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "You know, Joshua, I've spoken to my wife since I got here," he explained solemnly. "Don't ask me how, but I managed it. I've begged her for forgiveness, but she isn't ready to give it." He sighed deeply before continuing. "I don't blame her. I guess I still have penance to make. I miss my girls so much, but they've got their mother to look after them, wherever they are. But you have a son, Joshua, and he's all alone. It should be you who walks into the light. I'll find my own way when the time is right." I was overwhelmed with emotion upon hearing those words and awestruck by Marcus's selfless sacrifice. "I don't know what to say," I spluttered. "You don't have to say anything," was the warden's firm reply. "We'll go together. On 3. Marcus and I stood side by side, him facing the vortex and me the light. He counted down, and we ran forward in unison. The bright light consumed me, pulling me out of the darkness and dropping me somewhere new. As I write my final account, I am sitting on green grass with the sun shining down upon me. I'm surrounded by beauty and life in a pristine and colorful garden, but what brings me the most joy is my son. I watch as Kevin crawls along the soft grass before me, laughing joyfully as he experiences this paradise through the eyes of a child. Kevin is loved and safe, but it pains me that his mother isn't here with us. Perhaps one day Sally will make her way back to us, but sadly, this is beyond my control. It was supposed to be a nice break from the real world, a getaway to my cabin in the mountains for a few days to collect myself after the awful past few months. I bought my property from some old miners who had run the mountain dry. The cabin they had built only needed some minor improvements, and the remains of their fruitless mines made for some cool features to show friends. The big mine near the cabin couldn't even be called a mine, as they had essentially blown open the entrance to a cave wide enough to get tools inside. The night before I was going to head back, the largest rainstorm in a century hit. All roads leading back to civilization were flooded, and there was no chance my crappy car could hope to make it through. I wasn't too upset about it, just thankful I still had enough food to last me another few days. The truly awful part was that the shoddy power system I made had gone out, and my phone had died long ago. I needed to wait a while for the solar panels to charge, so I decided to make the best out of a bad situation. The rain had made the woods truly beautiful, and I still had around a dozen Polaroids to use in my camera. The walk was truly amazing. The rain had made the green in the forest even more vibrant, and the canopy had provided enough cover that I wasn't soaking wet. Only problem I ran into was the insane amount of broken branches on the trail. I knew the storm had been bad, but in my years of owning this cabin, I had never seen this amount of clutter pile up in such a short time. I had no idea how so many branches below the canopy had broken. I had been walking for a few hours before it started to get dark, and I decided to head back. I suddenly came up with the bright idea to take a photo of myself to commemorate the time I got rained out in the mountains. I turned on the flash and timer, setting my camera down on a nearby rock, and backed up a few feet. The only thing I heard before hitting the ground was the crack of wood splitting. Something had hit me in the head. Hard. Still dazed, I tried to figure out what just happened, but whatever hit me didn't give me the chance. It grabbed my ankle, rolling me onto my stomach and raising my leg into the air. There was a sudden blinding light, and everything stopped. I heard the Polaroid eject from the camera and softly land on the ground. I laid there for a minute, praying for the ringing in my head to subside. It took me a while to wrench my ankle free from the thing's hand and sit up. The person, monster, whatever it was just standing there, frozen. After the ringing in my head started to go away, I finally started to comprehend what I was looking at. It looked like a human, but the proportions were all wrong. It was too skinny, to the point where I could see every rib, bone, and tendon. The skin was taut, gray and wet. One hand was open, palm facing towards the camera, as if it was trying pointlessly to hide its face. If you could call it a face. Its head looked mangled, dented and bumpy, as if a child tried to mold a human skull out of clay. The eyes were the only part that resembled a human, although they looked empty somehow. The monstrosity had a piece of my calf between its pointed teeth. I had no idea what this thing was, but I figured that the flash from the camera had somehow stunned it. I got up to grab the camera, but the pain from my leg shot through me. I had to grab a stick off the ground to balance on, as I stumbled to the rock. I saw out of the corner of my eye that it was moving. It was so slow that I could barely tell, but its outstretched hand was definitely moving towards the camera. I wasn't about to let it destroy the only way I could defend myself. Pushing myself through the pain, I grabbed the camera and started back along the trail towards my cabin. If I could only make it back there, I had some only hunting gear that could maybe kill it. I don't know how long I had been walking. My bad leg and the cluttered trail made it painfully slow to traverse, and I tripped any time I tried to speed up. I counted 4 remaining Polaroids, but I was more concerned about the flash. I needed to make sure nothing damaged it, or I would be as good as dead. I noticed some landmarks saying I was about halfway back to my cabin when I heard the branches breaking behind me. I ducked off to the side of the trail and looked up at the trees. I saw a dark shape swing past me, moving faster than I could comprehend. It only made it a couple yards past me before it stopped, crouched up on a branch, searching for me. I readied my camera, pointing it at the creature in case it leaped at me. We stayed like that for some time, so long that it got dark enough I could barely see it. The rain clouds had covered up the moon, drowning the woods in an oppressive darkness. I would have had no idea it was there had it not been for the faint glow from its eyes, replacing the emptiness I had seen in them before. I nearly jumped out of my skin when it finally left, clambering onto other branches. I waited for a minute, making sure it was gone before stepping back onto the trail. I had taken a few steps when I heard something drop behind me. I turned as fast as I could before, Polaroid ready, and took another photo. It just was a stray branch, broken by the storm. I breathed a sigh of relief before realizing how grievous this mistake was. I just told the creature exactly where I was. I tried to run down the path, but I could already hear the approach of cracking wood. I backed up against a tree, aiming my Polaroid up in preparation. It landed on a branch above me, crawling down the opposite side of the tree to stay out of sight. I crawled away, but it was too fast, grabbing me by the shoulder. I managed to turn and point the camera, barely getting a photo off. I heard the Polaroid shoot from the camera and fall to the ground. I had to use all of my strength to pry its gangly fingers open. I turned to see the creature staring me in the eye, its bloody mouth open in a scream. I could already see it starting to move again. It wouldn't stay frozen for as long as it did last time. Not wasting any time, I started back on the trail. I was freezing cold and drenched to the bone. The remaining energy I had was fading, fast. I made out enough landmarks to know I was close to my cabin. A little less than a quarter of the trail was left before I made it. I hadn't heard any signs of the monster, but I figured it was freed from whatever shock the flash put it in. It wasn't long until I could reach my cabin, but if I kept pushing like this, I would trip and roll down the side of the mountain. I decided to sit underneath a short tree, a few feet off the trail, making sure to hide myself underneath the leaves as best I could. I rested my head against the bark, catching my breath. Using my brake, I checked on my leg only to find it a bloody mess. I put my camera in my coat pocket as I tore apart my pants to make a makeshift bandage. When I lifted my head, I saw the faint glow of a pair of eyes staring at me. It was following me, silently this time, just watching. As quickly as I could, I reached for the Polaroid and took a photo. I saw the blinding light and heard the gears push the Polaroid to the ground. But when my eyes adjusted, I saw nothing but trees. It moved out of the way. The creature leaped at me from behind, not about to give me the chance to get away again. It pinned me down, holding me with a force I had no idea it was capable of. I stared at it, waiting for it to bite into my neck and tear out what remaining life I had left. Before I could come up with a way out, it grabbed my face and forced my head down onto the ground. Everything went black. I woke up to the rough coldness of stone. I slowly sat up, feeling the back of my badly bruised and bleeding head. It was pitch black. I couldn't see my hands in front of my eyes. I stretched out my hands, feeling the coarse rock that surrounded me, until my hand drifted to a warm puddle. Following the liquid to its source, I felt coarse hair. It was a dead deer. I felt next to it, finding another dead animal, slowly discovering an ever-growing pile of animal corpses, all with their skulls caved in. That creature had brought me back to its den. Did it think I was dead? I reached into my coat pocket and let out a sigh of relief when I felt the familiar plastic of my camera. That relief suddenly turned into terror as I heard scratching coming from somewhere to my right. It must have heard me. I only saw one way out of this. I climbed into the pile of bodies, covering myself with organs and small animals. I heard the creature turn a corner, pacing around the room as it searched for me. The cover I made must have been good, as I heard it walk past me. The sounds of it walking slowly dwindled, until I heard nothing. Moving as quietly as possible, I slid out from under the pile of corpses I made, walking towards where I heard the monster enter. My progress was slow, but I kept quiet and hoped I had picked the right way to go. Just when I was about to give up and turn around, I felt hope, a breeze. I followed the breeze out, crawling through tunnels and shimmying through corridors until I could see the faint outline of an entrance. I leaped out of the cave, allowing myself to fully breathe for the first time in forever. Collecting myself, I searched around the outside of the cave for some kind of landmark to tell me where I was. I then saw a faint light to my right. It was my cabin. Whatever this monster was, it had brought me to the old cave near my cabin. It was pitch black out now, the rain still coming down hard. Thinking of the best course of action, I heard an ear-splitting scream come from somewhere deep in the cave. It already knew I made it out. I limped towards my cabin as fast as I could, throwing open the door and locking it behind me. The power had come back on while I was out being chased, and I wasted no time making sure every door and window was locked or covered. I was lucky the old miners only built one tiny window at the front of the cabin. I scrambled to find where I had left my phone, only to remember it was out of battery. I plugged it in, realizing I needed to wait until it was charged before I could leave. I wasn't getting through the storm in my car, so all I could hope for was to get far enough to reach a signal and call for help. Remembering my hunting equipment, I got out my rifle and some rusty foothold traps. I set the traps up at every door and a few spots in the cabin. The only thing to do now was wait for it. I lit a fire in the meantime, letting the warmth soak into my bones and harden my resolve to survive. It didn't take too long to hear scuttling along the outside of my house, going up towards the roof. I had never been more glad for a fire, knowing it couldn't go through the chimney without getting burned. The scuttling increased in speed and sound, as if the creature was getting frustrated it couldn't find a way in. It then started pounding on the doors, running between them, testing which one would give in first. I shot at the doors until my ears were ringing and my shoulder was numb, but the thing never stopped. I heard a crash as the window at the front broke, the monster's elongated arm reaching through and flailing around in an attempt to grab me. A few shots from my gun dissuaded it, but then it decided to make its own entrance, using what I could only imagine to be a large rock. The thing relentlessly beat on a wall until the wood started to split. No matter how many shots I put through that wall, it wouldn't stop breaking it down. I was frozen there, trying to think of a way out of fighting something I couldn't kill or trap. But it was already too late. The monster crashed through the wall, immediately rushing me and hitting me across the room. I sat there, the wind knocked out of me, watching as it approached. It knew it had me. No matter how many foothold traps it stepped in, it never slowed its approach. I wanted to save it in case I had to make a run from my car, but I had to use it now. I pulled out the camera, aiming it at the monster, and took a photo as it started to run, trying to stop me before I could press the shutter. I heard the gears grind and the Polaroid dropped to the ground, but I closed my eyes when I realized it. The flash didn't go off. I was about to die. I don't know when it happened, but my camera must have been damaged. It's probably toying with me now, waiting for me to open my eyes so it could make me watch as it devours me. But there was only silence. I finally opened my eyes. Its hand was only a foot away, reaching for the camera. It was frozen. I looked into its eyes, but something was wrong. That haunting glow was gone. All I saw was that familiar emptiness I had seen when it first attacked me. Confused, I dropped my camera and scrambled around it, going for the door. Something stopped me, and I looked back at the creature, seeing its hand slowly starting to move. I thought it was reaching for the camera, but it was going for the Polaroid. I cautiously approached, grabbing the Polaroid before the creature could. I expected the photo to look normal, but I instead saw a gray haze in the rough shape of the monstrosity standing before me. The haze in the photo looked as if it was moving, writhing around as if trying to escape. Taking the photo had ripped it out of the monster, and it wanted to go back. I knew what I had to do. I limped to the fireplace and tossed the photo in. The creature immediately started to scream. I imagine it would have deafened me if shooting the gun hadn't already. It dropped to its knees, its pale skin bubbling and bursting. It crawled towards the fireplace, using the last of its fleeting strength to fight against the burning agony it was in. In the end, it was too slow. By the time the Polaroid was ashes, the creature was only a pile of misshapen bones. I lit a fire in the meantime, letting the warmth soak into my bones and harden my resolve to survive. It didn't take too long to hear scuttling along the outside of my house, going up towards the roof. I had never been more glad for a fire, knowing it couldn't go through the chimney without getting burned. The scuttling increased in speed and sound, as if the creature was getting frustrated it couldn't find a way in. It then started pounding on the doors, running between them, testing which one would give in first. I shot at the doors until my ears were ringing and my shoulder was numb, but the thing never stopped. I heard a crash as the window at the front broke, the monster's elongated arm reaching through and flailing around in an attempt to grab me. A few shots from my gun dissuaded it, but then it decided to make its own entrance. Using what I could only imagine to be a large rock, the thing relentlessly beat on a wall until the wood started to split. No matter how many shots I put through that wall, it wouldn't stop breaking it down. I was frozen there, trying to think of a way out of fighting something I couldn't kill or trap. But it was already too late. The monster crashed through the wall, immediately rushing me and hitting me across the room. I sat there, the wind knocked out of me, watching as it approached. It knew it had me. No matter how many foothold traps it stepped in, it never slowed its approach. I wanted to save it in case I had to make a run from my car, but I had to use it now. I pulled out the camera, aiming it at the monster, and took a photo as it started to run, trying to stop me before I could press the shutter. I heard the gears grind, and the Polaroid dropped to the ground, but I closed my eyes when I realized it. The flash didn't go off. I was about to die. I don't know when it happened, but my camera must have been damaged. It's probably toying with me now, waiting for me to open my eyes so it could make me watch as it devours me. But there was only silence. I finally opened my eyes. Its hand was only a foot away, reaching for the camera. It was frozen. I looked into its eyes, but something was wrong. That haunting glow was gone. All I saw was that familiar emptiness I had seen when it first attacked me. Confused, I dropped my camera and scrambled around it, going for the door. Something stopped me, and I looked back at the creature, seeing its hand slowly starting to move. I thought it was reaching for the camera, but it was going for the Polaroid. I cautiously approached, grabbing the Polaroid before the creature could. I expected the photo to look normal, but I instead saw a gray haze in the rough shape of the monstrosity standing before me. The haze in the photo looked as if it was moving, writhing around as if trying to escape. Taking the photo had ripped it out of the monster, and it wanted to go back. I knew what I had to do. I limped to the fireplace and tossed the photo in. The creature immediately started to scream. I imagine it would have deafened me if shooting the gun hadn't already. It dropped to its knees, its pale skin bubbling and bursting. It crawled towards the fireplace, using the last of its fleeting strength to fight against the burning agony it was in. In the end, it was too slow. By the time the Polaroid was ashes, the creature was only a pile of misshapen bones. I grabbed my phone and car keys. I drove it as far as I could, but the shitty thing got stuck in the mud a few miles out from the nearest town. I managed to limp the rest of the way, pushing myself with energy I didn't know I had. I'm writing this in the home of a kind stranger as they try to call the police, but they can't get out here due to the storm. I should be able to upload this account with the little signal I can get. I'm realizing now that I should have stayed in my cabin, as all I've done is sentence another poor person to die. I see their eyes out in the tree line, dozens of glimmers as they stare at me, curious, waiting, watching. I don't know if taking photos with my phone will work. Even if it does, there's no way I can stop them all. I'm posting this as a warning. Stay out of the mountains. They've come to take back their land. Have you been seeing 999 everywhere you turn? Sometimes angel numbers like 999 keep appearing in our lives and creep us out with their eerie consistency. You know, you look at a receipt or a random license plate, and it says 999 all the time. Naturally, you start looking for its meaning, and you might find that the angel number 999 represents completion and new beginnings. But guess what? Encountering this number isn't always related to positive happenings. In a specific situation, your guardian angel might be sending you the number 999 as a sign to be wary, because major changes are coming in your life. Let's explore what angel number 999 really means, and whether it's actually worth being afraid of its presence in your life. The symbolism of angel number 999. Decoding the symbolism of the angel number 999 is especially relatable for betting enthusiasts. If you've ever tried to analyze patterns in betting arbitrage to reveal hidden outcomes, you probably understand the importance of cycles and context. In the same way, when you receive angel number 999, it's a signal to let go of past cycles and make space for something new. The reason is that the angel number 999 signifies completion and transition. The symbolism of this number is related to closing old doors and getting ready for new opportunities in life. The only scary thing is that you never know whether these opportunities will bring challenges or rewards. As a result, receiving this number all the time might make you feel like you're haunted by hidden forces. But most of the time, you just need to apply its symbolism to your specific situation and interpret it without giving it either a positive or negative connotation. Angel number 999 meaning for relationships. Similar to most angel numbers, 999 has a specific meaning for relationships. Considering that this number is related to endings in terms of relationships, it might be a sign that your current relationship is close to an end. However, sometimes people who receive this number automatically assume that something is wrong with their relationship and feel anxious or afraid of the unknown. If that's the case, you should know one thing. The angel number 999 is a sign of ending cycles. Therefore, maybe one chapter of your relationship is closing and the universe just wants you to get you prepared. But for singles, the meaning of 999 is less confusing. If you're not currently in a romantic relationship, this number is telling you that it's time to let go of your fears from past relationships and close the emotional door that doesn't allow you to build new, meaningful connections. Therefore, the meaning of angel number 999 doesn't have to be negative for romantic relationships. Angel number 999 meaning for career. Now, let's consider the meaning of angel number 999 for your professional life and career. As we pointed out, according to spiritual symbolism, this number often signifies an ending or transition. Naturally, the main reason why your guardian angel is sending you this sign is to think about your current career. Are you happy with your job? Maybe you're not as satisfied with it as you used to be, or it doesn't give you any more chance for personal development. Either way, it's likely that the angel number 999 is a subtle push to make a change in your career path, which might mean either quitting a job, an upcoming change in terms of position, or even switching to a completely new career. That's why you should be mindful of this reminder and try to align your life better with your goals and passions. What to do if angel number 999 keeps appearing? Even though you already know that the appearance of the angel number 999 isn't necessarily a bad sign, one thing is for sure: it can be upsetting to see it everywhere all the time. Therefore, people often wonder what they can do or when they will stop encountering this number. If that's the thing that worries you as well, you should know that no, you're not being haunted by the angel number 999. And if you want to stop it from appearing in your life, you need to react. Reaction in this case means following the signal of your guardian angel and getting ready for a necessary change that might change your life. Only after making this change will you be able to get free of the disturbing occurrence of the angel number 999 in your life. Spirituality experts believe that the basic purpose of angel numbers is to protect us and guide us while facing obstacles in life. But what if you feel like instead of support during challenging times, they are haunting you? It turns out that receiving the same divine signs over and over again is pretty confusing for many people all over the world. And it's understandable because it's not easy to deal with the message that something is going to change in your life, and you have to confront hidden fears. Plus, these numbers usually appear when we least expect them. In this article, we will focus on 5 angel numbers that might be haunting you instead of protecting you from dark forces. 1. Angel number 666. If the angel number 666 is the one that you're encountering everywhere, chances are that you're already feeling either terrified or at least confused. The reason is that this number is associated with dark forces in religion and culture. It doesn't matter where you get this number. While scrolling through your phone contacts in recent calls, or even while playing online slots on platforms like Bettervet Casino, it can be equally unsettling. Yes, you might have won a jackpot, but should you celebrate it or be worried about what comes next? Even though the angel number 666 is considered the number of love in numerology, people often report experiencing feelings of being haunted once this number starts appearing in their lives. 2. Angel number 111. If you take a look at the common interpretations of the angel number 111, you'll soon realize that most of them are positive. In fact, this number either symbolizes new beginnings and manifestations or leadership and individuality. That's because the digit 1 alone is associated with fresh starts. When repeated 3 times in 111, its power is increased even more. Still, there's a reason why this angel number is considered one of the most haunting ones. Some people associate this number with historical events that forever changed the world, such as the tragedy of 11 September. As a result, when they repeatedly encounter 111, they get scared of upcoming changes and get the unsettling feeling that somebody is watching them. 3. Angel number 13. It's one thing to feel like something as abstract as a number is haunting you and completely another when you receive an unlucky symbol over and over again. In the case of the angel number 13, the latter is what upsets people. The number 13, in general, is accompanied by various superstitions in most cultures. For example, many buildings skip the 13th floor to avoid misfortune, not to mention Friday the 13th, the famous day of bad luck. All things have a soul, from the stray rats that scamper through the streets to the swaying lanterns stifled by smog. Even the city itself is well and truly alive. Yet, to a foreigner like Edward, such wisdom was a mystery, and not one he had any interest in until it was forced upon him. Edward was relocated to Japan to serve as lead financial consultant in his company's newly opened Japanese branch. By all accounts, he was a terrible fit for the position. Not only did he lack knowledge of the country and its language, But he was also missing the ambition and experience necessary to succeed. The only reason Edward got the promotion was because no one else was willing to relocate, and Edward had his own reasons to leave it all behind. Nonetheless, Edward hoped to make the most of his move. It was a fresh start. He had planned to visit the historic temples of Kyoto, the snowy slopes of Hokkaido, and the hot springs of Hakone. But he never made it out of the city. He never had a chance to. Every day flowed seamlessly into the next. Wake, work, sleep, repeat. In the streets, Edward floated along the stream of salarymen and smoke-filled izakayas, where each face and neon light blurred together into a single, endless night. After a week in the city, the thought never even occurred to him to step out of line or see something new. Instead, he retraced his steps, day after day, and memorized every crack in the street. He knew that path more intimately than he knew his own face, so it came as a surprise one night when a sixth building had sprung up on a street that had only ever had 5. 7-Eleven had always stood on the corner lot with a dingy pharmacy beside it, and there was never any building in between. But on that day, a misplaced building of plaster and glass sat sandwiched between them. Its sudden appearance baffled Edward so much that he stopped and stood gawking as the crowd rushed around him. The windows of the building had that cloudy look you'd expect from decades of sticky Japanese summers, and the plaster was stained black in spots where a generation of car exhaust and street dust had left its mark. But that was all impossible. The property hadn't even existed until that night. Edward approached the building. By all laws of logic, it had no right to be there. Yet, as he looked around at the passers-by, they merely shuffled along their paths into the night-soaked city. No one else noticed or cared. Unlike the other shops on the street, this building had no signs or markings. Its only adornment was a battered gray door. The door was ajar, and a stale odor emanated from within. Edward stepped closer and made out the hushed sound of a woman's tears. Through the glossy windows, he spied a crouched silhouette hidden beneath a curtain of black hair. People flowed past, head down. However, Edward stood and watched the figure's shoulders shake to the rhythm of her muted sobs. It was an intimate moment and not one he should have been watching so intently. But he was invested now, and some part of him felt that he shouldn't look away. In an expansive city, where thousands upon thousands live, shouldn't there be at least one person to witness a woman's sorrow? Noticing Edward's concern, the woman stifled her sobs and turned to meet his curious gaze. At once, he recoiled in shock. The woman's face was smooth and featureless like a pale mannequin, fitted with a dense black wig whose frayed strands floated as though suspended in water. Retreating from the building, Edward stole a final glance at the window. A single doll-like hand was pressed against the glass, and a shallow whimper echoed outward. Disturbed by what he had seen, Edward quickly entered the 7-Eleven to calm his nerves with a drink. He passed down the aisle of liquor, muttering to himself all the while. "Too much work," he said. "That's it. All work, no sleep." He rubbed his eyes and wiped the sweat from his brow. A twitch started in his hands. Something strong, he decided. Crouching beside the whiskeys, Edward felt a wave of cold wash over his neck, and goosebumps prickled along his arm. He turned with a growing sense of dread in his gut. But it was just the cold of the fridge. Someone had left the door open. Edward walked to the fridge. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered. As he set his hand against the fridge door, the lights cut out, and another chill sank into his skin. It was the bite of frost, the ice pick to the jugular. It was the drowning river, the burying avalanche. And from the darkness, a face like winter breathed upon his neck. The lights kicked on, the cold withdrew, and Edward ran for the door. However, the store clerk sprinted after him, shouting in Japanese. Edward soon realized he had taken a bottle of whiskey without paying. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to. I just..." Taking out his wallet, he glanced back at the shop. In the corner by the fridge, he saw a woman in white standing with hair over her eyes. Gripped with panic, Edward took out as much cash as he could and shoved it into the clerk's hands. It must have been double what he needed to pay. But his mind was a disjointed patchwork seized by terror. Even the simplest arithmetic could not survive among the cascade of fretful thoughts that plagued him. Edward gave the money to the clerk and ran off again before the man could say anything. He looked over his shoulder every few steps. As far as he could tell, no one was following him. However, he could not shake the sensation that he was being watched. He looked around at the countless shaded windows and at the numerous alleys hidden in gloom. If someone was watching him, he had no way of knowing where they were. Shaking off the unnerving sensation, Edward hurried to his apartment. Perched on the 5th floor, he had a mesmerizing view of the fluorescent streets below. On many sleepless nights, he stood on his balcony to bathe in the flashing lights. But that night the lights seemed pale and weak while the darkness gathered in writhing forms. Edward's eyes fixed on the shadows, searching for what might lurk within. As he climbed the stairs to the 5th floor, he gazed at the ground below. Nothing and no one could surprise him if he kept his watch trained on the entrance. Yet when Edward finally landed on the 5th floor, he saw precisely what he did not wish to see. Standing at the opposite end of the corridor was the pale, faceless woman. Almost bashful, she stood in the shaded corner of the hall with her hands clasped in front of her. Just above her, the lights flickered intermittently. The strobing light cast the occasional glimmer on her eyeless stare. Edward proceeded with caution, and he dared not blink. He would give her no opportunity to frighten him more than she already had. Whatever it is the spirit desired, Edward wanted no involvement. He opened his mouth to tell her this, but his voice died in his throat. With a cautious step, Edward proceeded towards his apartment halfway down the corridor. The lights overhead failed, and for a brief moment, the woman disappeared. Yet, as the lights sputtered back on, she returned. This time her head was cocked to the side with threatening intrigue. Leaning forward through the throbbing shadow, a slit opened across her face, and as her head lurched back, the slit opened to reveal a gaping throat. "Gee shi!" The words hissed out of her like steam through a burst pipe. Uncertain what she said, Edward ignored her and shuffled through the hall. His room was only a few doors down. If he could just make it there, he'd be safe. Yet, when Edward next stole a look at the spirit, it stretched out a crooked white hand. Another string of incomprehensible words issued from the depths of the spirit's throat. Her cold, decayed voice sent Edward into a blind panic. Chest walloping, Edward sprinted to his door. His fingers fumbled for the keys in his pocket while the woman stood watching. Slowly, her hand fell to her side. Yet, to Edward's shock, she did not chase him. She merely stood in the pulsing shadows, watching. It was almost worse than the alternative. Stealing one last glance at the spirit, Edward slipped inside his apartment and flicked on the lights. He retreated from the door, watching, waiting, listening, and from the hall came the slow patter of feet. Edward stared at the gap under his door. The light outside still shuddered as the fluorescence flashed on and off. The steps seemed to come in rhythm with the faulty lighting. Every time the darkness returned, Edward heard the tap of feet against the stone floor. The closer the steps, the more the lights fluttered. In time, they strobed so violently that the light blared beneath the gap in the floor, blinding. With an electric crunch, the bulbs shattered and the lights died. Chest still heaving, Edward stood waiting. For a few moments, there was silence, and then came a slow, steady knock. "Hua shitai." "When it?" the spirit called from outside. I don't know what you're saying," Edward said. A long, low sigh issued from behind the door. The sound slid like steel through his ears, severing the last of his nerves. Like a frightened child, Edward felt impossibly small and fled to his bed for safety. If he was going to be killed by a ghost, he might as well do it in the comfort of his own bed. Yet Edward soon heard the woman's feet shuffle and the fading sound of her senseless muttering. He was alone in the cramped confines of his apartment. Somehow that was more terrifying than having the monster outside his door. In her absence, the dull hum of his appliances disturbed an otherwise silent backdrop. Without changing his clothes or even moving, Edward sat on the edge of his bed. He didn't so much as stir until dawn pried through his curtains, and when it had, he glanced with shock at his watch. Soon, it would be time to go to work, but the thought of leaving his room terrified him. He pulled out his phone and opened up his messages. Buried under a sequence of work-related texts, Edward found his daughter's name. He opened the message thread and started to write a heartfelt apology. He was sorry for what he had done and for what he was. He wished he were a better father, the kind that lived up to her once lofty opinion of him, the kind that put family first instead of his own selfish desires. He loved her. He always had and always would, no matter what happened. But Edward hesitated as his finger hovered over the send button, the weight of his shame greater even than his regret. Some wrongs, too deep, too grievous, could not be remedied. He read Laura's last message. "Please don't text me again. I will call Mom." With a heavy sigh, Edward set down his phone and headed to the shower. The water kicked on with a rusty screech. Due to the faulty heater, the shower wavered between scorching hot and bitter cold. Steam filled the cramped bathroom, fogging the mirror over. For a moment, Edward felt a sort of comfort in that. He could not see a ghost lurking there if he could not see anything at all. Yet, the absence of sights and sounds made Edward's mind concoct horrors just out of view. Half-heard creaks created specters behind the door. Wisps of wind blew into howling ghouls. Every shifting shadow sent shivers down his spine. But the ghostly woman never showed herself. Steeling himself, Edward shut off the water and exited the bathroom, armed only in a towel. He was still alone. Edward collected his phone and headed out the door. As he passed over the threshold, his phone made a cheery ping. Glancing down, he noticed a message from his daughter. Why does that sound like a goodbye? It appeared Edward had sent his message after all, though he was certain he hadn't. And now that he looked at his daughter's text, he had no idea what to say to her. He hadn't meant to sound so final, but perhaps she was right. Perhaps it was a goodbye. And if so, maybe it was better to leave it at that. For the time being, he said nothing. Edward shuffled to work. On his way there, he saw the same signalless building standing impossibly on a street where it did not belong. Yet under the sun's glare, the building showed no signs of malice or mischief, and the shadows stayed confined to the empty interior. Unmarked and unremarkable, the building was merely that. Work passed without incident. Edward had a noticeably jumpy mood and a manic gaze from his sleepless night. But by all other measures, the day was entirely normal. Night, on the other hand, brought a sudden, spiteful rain, the kind that beat against the windows and blistered the skin with its cold and bitterness. Edward kept an umbrella at his office for just such an occasion. Stepping out into the downpour, Edward turned his face to the sky. The matted rain clouds had vanished into the night, swallowed whole by its vacuous embrace. Neither star nor moon penetrated the black sheet above, yet the rain poured down all the same, and Edward fell into thought. How long had the unseen shaped his path? How long had the void hung over him? And now that he felt its grip, how could he ever be free of it? A sudden bump of the shoulder jostled Edward from thought. He turned to see a slender woman rush ahead. Her lengthy black mane billowed behind her with a scent like fresh-pressed asphalt and discarded cigarettes. Just as her featureless expression passed under the light, she opened her umbrella and melted into the crowd. An icy jitter entered Edward's veins, and he knew yesterday's nightmare had yet to release him. Edward hastened along his route home. All the while, his eyes darted from umbrella to umbrella. Any one of them could hide his faceless tormentor. However, it was no easy task to find her. The woman's umbrella was black, as was everyone else's, including his own. So instead, Edward sought out the woman's long, dark hair and loose white gown. Yet that too proved a fruitless strategy. Everywhere he looked, Edward saw the same somber style hidden beneath a downturned umbrella. The city had always crushed the individual and hammered him into the crowd. All men in the city were one and no one, all women a copy of the next. But this was more than a monoculture or a favored fashion. Wherever Edward looked, the women were truly identical. And as the realization dawned on him, the crowd stopped in its tracks. Their umbrellas tilted up to the falling rain, which pattered on, marking time in a senseless world. And their eyeless gazes narrowed upon him with unnerving unity. The spirit was not buried among the crowd. She was the crowd itself. All motion froze, and color drained from the world. Streetlights blinked gray, and rain fell as a dense ink that trailed down the crowd's bloodless cheeks. When Edward finally found the courage to sprint home, the sightless throng parted to watch him go. Their unblinking watch gored him through the back. Amid the monochrome legion, a single individual pushed far ahead. Edward watched her path through the people. As he began to catch up to the figure, Edward saw her slip into the depthless interior of that same impossible building. Some formless compulsion tugged him towards the gaping doorway. It gnawed at him with a sensation so visceral, so rooted in his being, that it demanded to be felt. Even so, he would not give in to it. Sprinting on towards his apartment, Edward wound his way up the stairs to the 5th floor. With each step he climbed, the building shifted. Scrawled characters crept across the walls like black ivy. Their inky stems reached ever closer to the staircase until they surrounded Edward in an unreadable jumble. As Edward reached the 5th floor, the dense script spoke in a dizzying tongue. The voice was that of a woman and also a man. It was her voice and his and all others as well. The sound burrowed into his eardrums, rebounding and resounding, building on itself until his vision went black. Even after he slipped inside his apartment, the clamor crashed through his body. It swung from ear to ear, ebbing slowly to a low drone. Once the noise finally died, Edward found himself curled in a ball on the floor. Stars danced across his eyes, and his chest heaved to an erratic rhythm. But he was safe now. Nothing could harm him in his room. Behind him, the floorboards creaked, and a hushed voice spoke. Da Zhang Fu. It said, its tone lifting up into a question. The hairs on Edward's neck prickled as the presence shifted nearer. He bolted out of his apartment, back into the bustle of the street. Except this time there was no bustle. No chatter of pedestrians, no murmur of cars, no rumble of trains. Even the rain had given way to a sudden, stifling silence. However, it was not merely the noise that had vanished. The roads were barren, and the buildings plain. All life had seeped out of the neighborhood. The city was dead, and Edward was alone. Edward hurried along the sidewalk, glancing all around. Somewhere far off echoed the drum of footsteps. First, it was ahead of him, and then a moment later behind. Out of the corner of his eye, Edward spied a flash of white fabric, and as he scanned the neon-lit streets, he caught sight of the woman once more. She looked back as if to ensure he was behind her. Although Edward could not understand her words or read her face, he knew she wanted him to follow. And by now it was clear that she would not leave him alone until he did. So against his best instincts, which trembled in his veins like a windswept fire, Edward followed along. He could already guess where the spirit wanted him to go. Trailing behind her in that desolate night, Edward found himself before the building that should not have been. The woman dipped inside, and though cloaked in shadow, her pale, beckoning fingers were still visible. He hesitated as a foul rot exuded from the interior. Its piercing bite penetrated his nostrils and delved into his lungs. Along with it came a keen chill that clawed its way into his skin. It rooted him in place and soaked into his flesh. Edward could not enter that space. Every primal instinct screamed that he would not leave as he had entered. "Doshitano," the spirit asked. Its words were gentle, sweet even. Despite his terror, Edward almost felt sorry for her and for what he was going to do. "I can't," he said. As soon as his hand touched the rusted doorknob, the woman bolted after him. If she had eyes, they might have narrowed. If she had lips, they might have scowled. But Edward tried not to think of it or her or the building again. He shut the door in her face and sprinted into the street. In that instant, the world shifted. Life returned to the city with a shout and a screech. A car barreled through Edward, dashing him upon the asphalt with a brutal thud. A sharp pain shot through Edward's back and radiated down his bloodied limbs. Vision still hazy, he stared upward at the depthless night. Salarymen passed by without a care in the world, and the car that had struck him simply drove away. Edward attempted to peel himself off the pavement, but something in him was broken. So he lay there motionless. His voice was weak in his throat, but he managed to speak. "Help me. Help me. I'm hurt," he said, but no one stopped. No one looked at him. "Can't you understand me? Can't you hear me?" The streetlights pulsed and flickered, indifferent to his suffering. And as Edward watched the people pass by, a familiar figure stood over him. Her pale face opened along a wide slit, and a toothless smile dominated her cheeks. "Please," Edward said. "I don't know what you want." The spirit grabbed him by the ankle and dragged him away as though he weighed nothing at all. Edward called out for help as the gaping maw of that impossible building came ever closer. However, not a single soul looked down at him. They carried on among the swirls of road dust and flaring fluorescence, each of them trapped within the confines of their own lives. Fear had taken Edward as easily as the spirit, but just as their absence cannot be ensured, even the most vile of emotions cannot last forever. A burdensome weight lifted from his shoulders. In place of fear, a precarious acceptance soon filled him, followed by a lethal dose of curiosity. Edward looked up at the approaching doorway, and for a single moment gazed inward. Imagination has a will of its own, and in frightful times, it so often burdens the mind with restless scenes of abject horror. In that shifting cloud of delusion, an agitated web of refracted thoughts can concoct man's worst nightmares. Yet Edward could never have viewed so much in so small a glimpse.